In this video, we'll be breaking down 2 hours of forgotten SpongeBob character lore to help you fall asleep. Let's get started. First up we got Smitty Verbenjagerman Jensen, represents one of the strangest and most memorable one-off characters in SpongeBob SquarePants history, despite only appearing in a single season 3 episode that aired on February 22nd, 2002. The character exists as a skeleton wearing a soda-drinking hat in a grave at Floater's Cemetery, and the entire plot of One Crab's Trash revolves around this dead fish who somehow owned what becomes a $1 million item. What makes Smitty especially interesting in the context of forgotten characters is that he technically appears on screen for just a few minutes near the end of the episode, yet his name and the circumstances of his appearance left a lasting impression on fans who watched the show during its early years. The episode begins with Mr. Krabs hosting a yard sale in his front yard, where he dumps literal trash from garbage cans onto a rug and tries to sell these items as valuable antiques. SpongeBob and Patrick show up while eating lollipops, and SpongeBob spots a soda drinking hat with the number 1 on it. Mr. Krabs convinces SpongeBob that this hat was made for him, telling him he was born to wear it. SpongeBob desperately wants the hat and scrounges up money from his couch, his clothes, and his piggy bank to come up with $5.68, which is all he has. Mr. Krabs agrees to take this amount and also deduct $4.32 from SpongeBob's future paycheck to make up the full $10 asking price. SpongeBob leaves happily with his new hat, completely unaware of what happens next. After SpongeBob walks away, a fish approaches Mr. Krabs and offers him $500 for that exact hat. Then another fish offers $1,000. Then another offers $100,000. Finally, a fish named Fred rows up in a rowboat through a river of Mr. Krabs' drool and offers $1 million for the hat. This sequence establishes that the soda-drinking hat SpongeBob just bought for pocket change is actually worth a fortune. Mr. Krabs immediately panics and runs after SpongeBob to get the hat back. He finds SpongeBob in his front yard blowing bubbles while wearing the hat. SpongeBob is completely happy with his purchase and tells the hat he has named it Hattie. Mr. Krabs tries several tactics to get the hat back. First, he tells SpongeBob the hat makes him look like a girl, hoping SpongeBob will be embarrassed and return it. SpongeBob just asks if he's a pretty girl, and Mr. Krabs tells him he's beautiful. This approach fails completely. Later, Mr. Krabs returns with a bag full of other novelty hats, trying to trade them for SpongeBob's soda drinking hat. He shows SpongeBob an air-conditioned hat with a fan, a juicer hat, and a foxy grandpa hat. SpongeBob turns down all of these offers because he has already bonded with his hat and calls it Hattie. Mr. Krabs is frustrated because he genuinely thought the foxy grandpa hat would seal the deal. Every legitimate attempt to get the hat back through trading or convincing SpongeBob has failed, so Mr. Krabs decides he needs to use fear tactics instead. That night, SpongeBob is sleeping in his bed while still wearing the soda drinking hat. Mr. Krabs sneaks up to SpongeBob's window with a fishing pole and a notepad. He draws a ghost on a piece of paper and attaches it to the fishing line. He drops SpongeBob wakes up but sees the paper backwards, showing the reverse side, which has a shopping list written on it with the words milk, eggs, cheese. SpongeBob screams about a floating shopping list. Mr. Krabs has to turn the paper around to show the ghost drawing he made. Then Mr. Krabs announces that he is the ghost of soda drink hats. He hangs down another piece of paper showing a drawing of the soda drinking hat and tells SpongeBob that the hat is cursed. SpongeBob asks why the hat is cursed, and Mr. Krabs explains that it once belonged to some guy who is now dead. When SpongeBob asks what guy, Mr. Krabs has to make up a name on the spot. He stammers and comes up with Smitty something. SpongeBob asks Smitty what, and Mr. Krabs continues making up the name as he goes, saying Smitty Verben Jagerman Jensen. SpongeBob immediately responds by saying he must have been number 1, referencing the number 1 printed on the hat. Mr. Krabs agrees and adds that Smitty Verben Jagerman Jensen was number 1 in Boogieland. He tells SpongeBob that a curse will descend on him unless he returns the hat to its original owner immediately. SpongeBob keeps asking questions to clarify, asking if he means immediately to the owner and right now. Mr. Krabs loses his patience and confirms yes, the hat must be returned to its owner right now. SpongeBob appears behind Mr. Krabs holding a shovel and covered in dirt. He tells Mr. Krabs that he was just returning the cursed soda drinking hat to its original owner, Smitty Verbenjagerman Jensen. Mr. Krabs is shocked and asks what SpongeBob means. SpongeBob calmly explains that Smitty Verbenjagerman Jensen is buried out in Floater's Cemetery. This revelation completely stuns Mr. Mr. Krabs because he made up the name randomly, yet somehow a person with that exact name actually exists and is buried in the local cemetery. Mr. Krabs grabs SpongeBob in disbelief and tells him there is no Smitty Verben Jagerman Jensen, but SpongeBob insists that there is and that he's buried in the cemetery. Mr. Krabs is so frustrated and confused that he stammers several incomplete sentences before finally giving up. He grabs the shovel from SpongeBob and walks off toward Floater's cemetery, grumbling in frustration. SpongeBob calls after him, saying it was Smitty's hat and that he was number 1. Mr. Krabs now has to go dig up this grave to retrieve the hat he sold to SpongeBob just hours earlier. The cemetery scene starts with Mr. Krabs arriving at Floater's cemetery at night. The atmosphere is creepy with eerie moaning sounds and a clam sitting on a tree branch hooting like an owl. A bunch of clams fly over Mr. Krabs' head and a black snail growls at him. He tells himself to hold it together, reminding himself that this is just a boneyard filled with bones. While walking through the cemetery, he encounters Squidward, who is crying and placing flowers on a tombstone. After Squidward leaves, Mr. Krabs walks up to that tombstone and reads it. The tombstone says, "Here lies Squidward's hopes and dreams." Mr. Krabs calls Squidward a baby and then refocuses on his mission. He needs to find Smitty Verben Jagerman Jensen's grave. He starts checking tombstones throughout the cemetery, saying nope and no to each one he reads. The scene cuts to show more time passing as he continues searching, checking every single headstone he can find. Eventually, he stops and realizes he has checked every headstone in the entire cemetery, and there is no Smitty Wabba Blabba buried there. He tries to think of something SpongeBob said that might give him a clue about where the grave is located. Several thought bubbles of SpongeBob appear as Mr. Krabs tries to remember useful information. The first thought bubble shows SpongeBob saying, "Remember, licking doorknobs is illegal on other planets." Mr. Krabs dismisses this as unhelpful. The second thought bubble shows SpongeBob saying, "You'll never guess what I found in my sock last night. Go ahead, guess." Mr. Krabs repeatedly says no and dismisses this memory too. The third thought bubble shows SpongeBob saying, "It was his hat, Mr. Krabs. He was number 1. This is the memory from earlier that evening, when SpongeBob was explaining about returning the hat. Mr. Krabs punches the thought bubble away in frustration. He shouts, "Barnacles!" and starts to say he'll never find the grave. But then he looks directly in front of him and sees Smitty's tombstone right there. The tombstone reads Smitty Werben Man Jensen. This is notable because the name on the actual tombstone is slightly different from what Mr. Krabs made up. Mr. Krabs said Smitty Werben Jagerman Jensen, but the tombstone says Smitty Werben Man Jensen. Regardless of the slight name variation, Mr. Krabs has found the grave. He stops to consider whether he's really going to defile this grave for money, and he immediately answers his own question by saying, "Of course I am." He starts digging and quickly hits something. He opens up the coffin and finds Smitty's skeleton inside, and the skeleton is wearing the soda drinking hat. Mr. Krabs is thrilled to see the hat and calls it beautiful. He tells it to come to Papa. However, the hat is stuck on Smitty's skull. Mr. Krabs pulls on the hat and tells Smitty to let go. He ends up pulling Smitty's entire skull off his skeleton body with the hat still attached to it. Mr. Krabs then pulls the skull off the hat. He tells Smitty to rest in pieces and jumps out of the hole holding the $1 million hat triumphantly. He celebrates that he got the $1 million hat. Immediately, lightning and thunder boom across the cemetery. Smitty's skeleton stands up from the grave, holding his own skull in one hand. The skeleton speaks and says, "Hey man, that's my hat. Give it back." This is the actual introduction of Smitty Verben Jagerman Jensen as a character who can talk and move around. Mr. Krabs refuses and tells Smitty to crawl back into his hole. He calls him Bone Boy and tells him to go ahead and play dead. Smitty responds by saying he's going to have to take the hat from Mr. Krabs. Mr. Krabs challenges him, asking, "You and what army?" Smitty reveals that he has exactly that, an army. All around Mr. Krabs, skeleton zombies rise from their graves, surrounding him and moaning eerily. Smitty introduces them as the army of the living dead, and all the other dead bodies start walking closer toward Mr. Krabs. Mr. Krabs becomes scared and says he has seen this on The Late Show. He describes what he thinks will happen. The ghoulish fiends will hold him down and take turns nibbling on his innards, then eat his brain and leave his body for the buzzards. Smitty responds that this is disgusting and clarifies they just want the hat back. Despite being surrounded by an army of the undead, Mr. Krabs still refuses to give up the hat. He shouts, "No flipping way," and grabs the head of a swordfish corpse to use as a weapon. He wields it like a sword and tells them to back up. Smitty gives the command to attack. The skeleton zombies ready their weapons, and Mr. Krabs charges forward shouting, "Tally-ho!" What follows is an extended fight sequence where Mr. Krabs battles the entire skeleton army by himself. He sword fights several zombies while shouting, "Look at me, I'm Errol Flynn," which is a reference to the actor Errol Flynn, who is famous for swashbuckling roles. Mr. Krabs chops up more skeletons and taunts them, saying they're falling apart and calling them marrow brain. He fights 4 zombies who are standing on top of each other. He jumps over groups of zombies and continues destroying them. The fight continues until morning, and Mr. Krabs successfully defeats every single skeleton zombie in the army. The scene transitions to morning, with Mr. Krabs running out of the cemetery with the hat in his claws. He's celebrating that he has $1 million. He runs back to his yard sale where the 4 salesfish from earlier are all talking to each other. Mr. Krabs announces that he got the rare novelty soda drinking hat and wants to start the bidding at $1 million. All 4 fish start laughing. Fred asks if Mr. Krabs wants the $1 million all at once, which is clearly sarcastic. Another fish says $1 million and asks if Mr. Krabs is kidding. The fish named Nat tells Mr. Krabs that he's not kidding and asks if he didn't hear the news. Nat explains that they found a whole warehouse full of these soda-drinking hats, which means they're completely worthless now. The camera shows a dumpster full of identical soda-drinking hats with the number 1 on them. All the salesfish laugh at Mr. Krabs. While this is happening, SpongeBob walks by wearing a completely different novelty hat. This new hat has clapping hands on top of it. SpongeBob makes a joke saying, "Let's give Mr. Krabs a big hand," and the hands on his hat clap. Nat sees this new hat and declares that one is worth $1 million. He runs after SpongeBob, and all the other salesfish follow him, each trying to outbid each other for SpongeBob's new hat. Fred even rows his rowboat along the ground to chase after SpongeBob. Mr. Krabs is left standing alone with the worthless soda-drinking hat. He says, "Well, that's a spirit breaker," and tosses the hat away. He breaks down sobbing over everything he went through for nothing. The episode ends with Squidward walking past carrying flowers, presumably to visit the cemetery again. He sees Mr. Krabs crying and calls him a baby, which is the exact same thing Mr. Krabs said about Squidward earlier when he saw Squidward's hopes and dreams tombstone. This full circle ending closes out Smitty Verbenjager-Munjensen's only appearance in the series. Smitty himself only appeared during the cemetery sequence, speaking just a few lines of dialogue, yet the character became part of SpongeBob history because of how absurd and memorable the situation was. The character of Smitty Verbenjager-Munjensen demonstrates how SpongeBob SquarePants created memorable moments with characters who barely had any screen time. Smitty was essentially a plot device who existed because Mr. Krabs made up a random name, and that name coincidentally belonged to a real dead person in the local cemetery. The fact that Smitty could reanimate as a skeleton, speak, and command an army of the undead added an extra layer of supernatural comedy to the episode. The character never appeared again after One Krabs Trash, making him truly a forgotten character in the sense that the show moved on from this concept and never referenced it in future episodes. However, fans who watched Season 3 during its original run remembered Smitty and the bizarre circumstances of the episode. The name itself became something of a meme among SpongeBob fans because of how ridiculous and elaborate it was. Mr. Krabs creating this name on the spot, only for it to turn out to be a real person, exemplified the kind of absurd humor that defined early SpongeBob. The episode showed that even characters who appeared for just a few minutes could leave a lasting impression through creative writing and unexpected plot twists. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Kevin C. Cucumber. I'm your biggest fanatic. Kevin C. Cucumber. I'm your biggest fanatic. Kevin C. Cucumber stands as one of the most memorable antagonists in early SpongeBob SquarePants history, appearing as the main villain in the Season 2 episode I'm Your Biggest Fanatic, which aired on April 14, 2001. Unlike many one-episode characters who simply exist as background elements or minor plot devices, Kevin serves as the central figure driving the entire conflict of the episode. He represents a specific type of villain that the show explored during its early years, someone who uses their social status and perceived expertise to bully and humiliate those who admire them. Kevin is a sea cucumber who wears glasses and has a crown-like structure coming from his head. He leads a group called the Jelly Spotters, which is described in the episode as Bikini Bottom's premier jellyfish enthusiast club. The episode takes place at the biannual Jellyfish Convention, where everything is about jellyfish and various jellyfish-related attractions are on display. The episode begins with SpongeBob and Patrick arriving at the convention. SpongeBob is wearing a jellyfish hat, and Patrick has a net on his head. They explore various exhibits including state-of-the-art jellyfish nets, a giant harpoon from Jellyfish the Movie, and they meet Dr. Manowar, who is a fish with a giant sore on his cheek. Dr. Manowar got stung by something called Big Lenny and lived to tell about it. He talks into a microphone and tells the crowd that his sore only hurts when you touch it. Patrick immediately walks up and touches it, causing Manowar to scream in pain. A security guard has been following Patrick around because Patrick keeps touching things he's not supposed to touch. After several incidents, the guard asks Patrick if he has to follow him all day. Eventually, SpongeBob spots something that excites him more than anything else at the convention. He sees a crowd gathered around a group of fish and asks Patrick if it can really be what he thinks it is. Patrick guesses ice, cream, but SpongeBob corrects him and says it's the Jelly Spotters. The camera shows the crowd surrounding this club, and their leader is standing in the center. SpongeBob describes Kevin as the coolest jellyfish enthusiast ever. The camera pans up from Kevin's feet to his face to reveal Kevin the sea cucumber. Patrick is not impressed and asks what's so great about a nerdy pickle. SpongeBob responds by saying if he could just touch the hem of Kevin's pocket protector, then maybe some of Kevin's greatness would rub off on him. Patrick tells SpongeBob that as a friend, he must say that's really geeky. Then Patrick sees someone in a giant jellyfish costume and completely abandons his criticism of SpongeBob. Patrick gasps and shouts that it's Jeffrey Jellyfish and says he has to touch him. Patrick runs after Jeffrey Jellyfish with the security guard chasing after him. The scene cuts back to Kevin addressing the crowd of fans. Someone asks Kevin about bamboo, and Kevin responds that he only uses composite materials in his net handle. The entire crowd writes this down in their notebooks. They all mutter, "composite materials," while taking notes. Kevin says next question, and the crowd writes down next question, as if that's also important information they need to record. SpongeBob suddenly pops out in front of the crowd with huge pupils and speaks as if in a trance. He simply says, "Hi, Kevin." The crowd stops chattering and looks at him. Kevin responds by saying hi and asking what SpongeBob's question is. SpongeBob just says, "Hi, Kevin," again. Kevin says whatever and tells someone else to ask the next question. He points to the other side of the crowd, but SpongeBob pops up there too and says, "Hi, Kevin," again. Kevin calls him a loser and says he'll take a question from someone way in the back. SpongeBob pops up way in the back and says, "Hi, Kevin," once more. Kevin starts to ask if anyone has an actual question, but then he hears SpongeBob breathing heavily from the left. Kevin and everyone else turn to see SpongeBob standing there breathing in an unsettling way. SpongeBob says hi to Kevin and tells him he's his biggest fan. Kevin responds by saying SpongeBob is too kind, then immediately yells for security. SpongeBob panics and tells Kevin to wait, saying he would do anything for him. Kevin suggests SpongeBob should go jump off a building. The scene shows Kevin hearing SpongeBob scream, and through a window Kevin sees SpongeBob falling. Then SpongeBob appears back in the building and repeats that he'll do anything. Kevin tells him to punch himself in the face. SpongeBob does exactly that using a boxing glove. His face gets pushed in from the impact. Kevin asks if that doesn't hurt SpongeBob. SpongeBob holds up a metal glove with spiked knuckles and asks Kevin if he wants it to hurt him. Kevin and all the jelly spotters start laughing. Kevin says that is the best, and they continue laughing. Kevin decides they have to bring this guy, jellyfishing, with them. One of the anchovy jelly spotters says no and calls SpongeBob a geek. Kevin whispers to the anchovy that he won't actually let SpongeBob join the club. He explains he just wants to see how many times SpongeBob can get stung before he goes running home like a baby. The anchovy calls Kevin a genius, and all the other anchovy jelly spotters join in, repeatedly saying Kevin is a genius. Kevin then asks SpongeBob how he would like to try out for the jelly spotters. The scene shows SpongeBob on a hospital bed. A doctor says clear and zaps SpongeBob with a defibrillator. SpongeBob jumps up and says he'd love to try out. The scene cuts to what appears to be Kevin and the jelly spotters walking through jellyfish fields. Kevin says nothing is like driving through jellyfish fields with the top down. The jelly spotters meep in agreement. The camera pans down to reveal that SpongeBob is actually carrying all of them. He stops and breathes heavily, announcing they've arrived at jellyfish fields. He collapses from exhaustion. The jelly spotters get off of him. Kevin says he hopes SpongeBob didn't forget their nets. SpongeBob says he didn't forget them and that they're in the trunk. SpongeBob turns around and the back of his pants opens like a trunk. He takes the nets and jars out, which reveals SpongeBob's buttocks. SpongeBob now has all the nets and jars in his arms. He says he can't believe he's out here with the jelly spotters, and that all his life he wanted to be a jelly spotter. SpongeBob starts vibrating and jumping around while talking rapidly about being with Kevin and the nets and jars and jellyfish and how they're all jellyfishing together, and it's fun. Kevin tells him to hold it, and SpongeBob literally freezes in place. Kevin announces that before SpongeBob can become a jelly spotter, he has to pass a rigorous test. The jelly spotters laugh and say rigorous test while continuing to laugh. Kevin tells them to be quiet. He then tells SpongeBob his first test is to catch a jellyfish. A jellyfish immediately flies into SpongeBob's net. SpongeBob asks if he's a jelly spotter now. The jelly spotters meep about how he caught one and discuss whether he's in the club. Kevin says that doesn't count. He slaps the net and the jellyfish flies out and stings the side of Kevin's head. Kevin yells, "Ouch!" and the jellyfish flies away. Kevin grows a giant red sore where he got stung. An anchovy jelly spotter makes a mocking wah, wah, wah sound off screen. Kevin changes the test and says he meant 2 jellyfish. 2 jellyfish immediately fly into SpongeBob's net. The jelly spotters meep about 2 jellyfish being in the net. Kevin says that's not what he meant and changes it again to 20 jellyfish. 18 more jellyfish immediately fly into SpongeBob's net, giving him the 20 Kevin asked for. SpongeBob starts counting them, saying 1, 2, 3. Kevin growls in frustration and kicks the net. This causes all 20 jellyfish to sting, him in a blaze of electricity. Kevin screams in pain as the jellyfish fly off, leaving him with a bunch of sores all over his body. The anchovy makes the mocking wah 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 sound again. The scene transitions with a bubble to later in the fields where Kevin is holding a jar of jelly. Kevin explains that jelly spotters allow jellyfish to eat jelly off their face. He smears some jelly on the lower half of SpongeBob's face. SpongeBob asks who wants to lick his cheeks. Some jellyfish swim by, and SpongeBob says he has some takers. Kevin asks how it feels. SpongeBob laughs and says it tickles his nose. He now has a huge jellyfish mustache and beard formed by the jellyfish eating the jelly. Kevin says, "Not for long," and he and the jelly spotters snicker. SpongeBob sneezes, which fires the entire swarm of jellyfish onto Kevin's eyes. They sting his eyes, and now Kevin has big red swollen eyes. The anchovy makes the mocking sound again. Kevin turns to the fish making that noise and asks if he'll cut that out. SpongeBob asks if he's in the jelly spotters now. Kevin says no, but that he has many more tests for SpongeBob to take. Multiple bubble transitions show a montage of SpongeBob completing various tests, all of which end with Kevin getting stung instead. SpongeBob walks upside down with a net and a jellyfish, then asks if he's in the jelly spotters now. The jellyfish flies out and stings Kevin's nose, making it big and swollen. Kevin says no. The next scene shows SpongeBob having caught a jellyfish while blindfolded. He asks if he's in the jelly spotters now. The jellyfish flies out and stings Kevin's crown structure, which becomes swollen into some broccoli-shaped blister. Kevin says no again. The montage continues with just SpongeBob asking, "Now?" followed by zapping sounds and Kevin appearing with different body parts swollen. His ears become big and swollen. Kevin says no. SpongeBob asks now again, and Kevin's lips become huge and swollen. Kevin says no. SpongeBob asks now once more, and a jellyfish zaps Kevin's butt, making it huge and swollen. Kevin screams, "No!" SpongeBob keeps asking now, repeatedly, with jellyfish zapping Kevin each time. After a large zap, Kevin is shown completely big and swollen from getting zapped several times all over his body. Kevin is infuriated and tells SpongeBob it's his turn to get zapped. He quickly realizes what he just said and corrects himself, asking if SpongeBob is ready for his final test. SpongeBob says he's ready. Kevin announces they're going to capture a queen jellyfish. SpongeBob asks if he can help. Kevin says they can't do it without him. The scene cuts to SpongeBob tied by his arms and legs, hanging from 2 sticks. SpongeBob says this is fantastic and that he's never been bait before. He also mentions he doesn't think he's ever seen a queen jellyfish either. Kevin says SpongeBob has probably never used a queen jellyfish call either and tells him to try it out. Kevin hands SpongeBob a blower instrument. SpongeBob blows it, and the instrument makes a weird groaning sound that sort of sounds like the word loser. SpongeBob says he's heard this call before. Kevin says he bets SpongeBob has. The jelly spotters start walking away. SpongeBob asks where they're going. Kevin says not to worry, and that they'll be right behind a nearby bush. The jelly spotters kneel down behind the bush and get zapped by a jellyfish. A jellyfish flies off, and Kevin stands up covered in even more sores. He asks who has his sting ointment, then kneels back down. SpongeBob continues blowing the horn and says this is great, explaining that when he passes this test, he'll be an official jellyfish spotter. He keeps blowing the horn, which continues saying loser. Eventually, it becomes dark, and SpongeBob is tired of blowing the horn. He calls out to Kevin that he doesn't think it's working and that nothing is happening. A giant shadow looms over SpongeBob. He looks up to find a giant jellyfish with a tiara on its head. SpongeBob gets excited and calls out to Kevin that she's here. He keeps trying to get Kevin's attention, saying, "Look, she's here," repeatedly. The bush blows away to reveal nothing except Kevin's ointment bottle. SpongeBob screams, and the jellyfish zaps the poles off. SpongeBob runs up and down hills, trying to dodge the jellyfish's stingers. He reaches a cliff and can't go any further. He gets on his hands and knees and begs the jellyfish not to be angry, saying he would have let her go if he could. He cries. Then a screen opens on the jellyfish, revealing Kevin and the jelly spotters controlling the machine from inside. They're all laughing. SpongeBob gasps and says, "Kevin!" Kevin confirms it's him and says SpongeBob should have seen the look on his face when they zapped him. SpongeBob asks, what about his final test? They all laugh at him. Kevin asks if SpongeBob really thought they'd actually let him join the jelly spotters. SpongeBob says Kevin was his biggest fan. Kevin points to the bottom of the cliff, where a bunch of people are gathered by a fire. One person looks up and says, "Hey, look everybody, Kevin's back." And they all yell up at Kevin in praise. Kevin tells SpongeBob he looked so dumb with his dorky jellyfish call. Kevin and the jelly spotters start imitating the call, saying, "Loser, loser, 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 loser." SpongeBob blushes and frowns sadly. He says he is not a loser. Kevin responds by drawing out the word loser As Kevin and the others continue taunting SpongeBob, a giant jellyfish appears from the cliff. This jellyfish is even bigger than the fake queen. It's wearing a robe and a crown. Kevin stops laughing. The jelly spotters finally notice the jellyfish. Kevin identifies it as Cnidaria rex. SpongeBob recognizes it as King Jellyfish. The king sees the robot queen and instantly falls in love. The king grows lips and puckers up to kiss it. Kevin yells, "Kissy face," and the robot queen runs away with SpongeBob still tied to it. The king gives chase. The queen eventually crashes into a billboard advertising Kevin's ointment and breaks apart. The king jellyfish makes a confused sound when it sees the robot is broken. It then sees Kevin, the jelly spotters, and SpongeBob. There's a record scratch sound effect. Kevin quivers in fear. The king jellyfish says, "Kevin," in an angry voice. It zaps the ground and they all run off. They find shelter in a cave. The king jellyfish comes back wearing a helmet and football uniform and attempts to bash into the cave. Inside the cave, the jelly spotters and SpongeBob are all scared. The bashing stops. Kevin thinks the jellyfish is gone and tells one of them to go out and check. The jelly spotters push one anchovy out of the cave. The anchovy looks around and meeps happily, giving the all-clear signal. He soon gets zapped and meeps to warn them not to come out. All the jelly spotters gather around Kevin and meep frantically, asking him to save them. Kevin says not to, look at him, and admits he was just in this for the fashion. The camera shows a close-up of Kevin's pants, which have patches, stickers, and a toy jellyfish coming out of his pocket. Kevin says it's hopeless and that they're trapped. He sits down and curls into a ball. He cries out for help from his mommy and says he wants his blankie. SpongeBob asks the other fish what they should do now. The jelly spotters all get down and start imitating Kevin's panic. SpongeBob decides this is enough and goes out to face the king. The king growls and buzzes at SpongeBob. SpongeBob takes out a bottle of bubble mix in response. The king makes a confused sound. SpongeBob inhales and blows a bubble in the shape of a giant cherry pie. The king is satisfied with this offering and leaves to eat his snack, saying, "Yummy," as he enjoys the pie. The jelly spotters come out of the cave and gather around SpongeBob. They meep happily. Kevin follows them out. He says he can't believe what just happened and asks SpongeBob how he knew that would work. SpongeBob laughs and says everybody loves pie. The anchovy makes his mocking wah 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 sound. Kevin tells SpongeBob that what he did was impressive, but he's still not in the club because he didn't catch a queen jellyfish. The other jelly spotters narrow their eyes at Kevin and run over to him off screen. Kevin asks what they're doing. There's a ripping sound and Kevin screams. The jelly spotters run back with Kevin's crown and place it on SpongeBob's head. SpongeBob laughs and says he didn't know this was a hat. Kevin appears teary-eyed with a torn part where his crown used to be attached to his head. He says sadly that it wasn't a hat. The episode ends back at the convention where SpongeBob talks to Patrick. Patrick asks if SpongeBob got into the club. SpongeBob says yeah, but he turned them down because it's not about Kevin, it's about jellyfish. Patrick tells SpongeBob he's glad he learned his lesson and says hero worship is unhealthy. The camera pans out to show that Patrick has Jeffrey Jellyfish tied up in a wagon he's towing behind him. Patrick tells Jeffrey to come along as he and SpongeBob walk off together. Kevin Sea Cucumber serves as an excellent example of how SpongeBob SquarePants created complex antagonists even in early seasons. Unlike simple villains who are evil for the sake of being evil, Kevin has recognizable human motivations and flaws. He enjoys his status as the leader of a popular club and uses that position to feel superior to others. When someone shows genuine admiration for him, rather than appreciating it, Kevin sees it as an opportunity to humiliate that person for his own entertainment. The episode explores the toxic side of fandom culture and how people in positions of authority within hobby communities can abuse that power. Kevin's character also demonstrates cowardice when faced with real danger, completely falling apart and crying for his mother when the king jellyfish attacks. This stands in stark contrast to his earlier confidence when he was safely mocking SpongeBob from inside the fake queen jellyfish robot. The writers made Kevin deliberately unsympathetic by showing him repeatedly getting stung by jellyfish throughout the episode, which serves as karma for his cruel behavior. Each time SpongeBob succeeds at a test, Kevin moves the goalposts and ends up getting hurt instead. The physical comedy of Kevin's body parts becoming progressively more swollen and damaged makes his eventual breakdown and humiliation feel earned rather than mean-spirited. The episode also uses Kevin to comment on gatekeeping in enthusiast communities, where self-appointed experts create arbitrary barriers to entry and judge others based on superficial criteria rather than genuine passion for the subject. SpongeBob's superior knowledge and skills with jellyfish are demonstrated throughout the episode, yet Kevin refuses to acknowledge them because admitting SpongeBob's competence would threaten his own position as the supposed expert. The final scene where the jelly spotters literally strip Kevin of his crown and give it to SpongeBob represents a complete reversal of the social hierarchy Kevin tried so hard to maintain. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Mystery the Seahorse. My Pretty Seahorse. Mystery the Seahorse. My Pretty Seahorse. Mystery the Seahorse represents one of the most significant animal companions SpongeBob ever had during the original run of the series, appearing in the Season 3 episode My Pretty Seahorse, which aired on July 12, 2002. Unlike most pets or animal characters that appear briefly in SpongeBob episodes, Mystery played a central role in the entire story and created genuine chaos at the Krusty Krab. The episode explores themes of responsibility, attachment, and the difficulty of letting go of something you care about, even when keeping it creates serious problems. Mystery herself never speaks or shows human-level intelligence like some other animals in the show, but her actions drive the entire plot and create conflict between SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs. The character demonstrates how SpongeBob's enthusiasm and good intentions can lead to disaster when he refuses to acknowledge the practical problems his choices create for others. The episode begins during springtime in Bikini Bottom. The French narrator explains that all sea creatures have an innate sense of seasonal changes. Patrick demonstrates this by jumping out of his rock, wearing a purple sweater, scratching his back, and announcing that it's spring. He then takes off the sweater and buries it in the sand for safekeeping until winter returns. SpongeBob walks outside and smells the air, saying he'd better call the doctor because he's got spring fever. He greets some little flowers and says good morning to Squidward, asking if it's a lovely day. Squidward responds with a confused, "Huh?" And SpongeBob asks if Squidward has said hello to the flowers yet. Squidward scoffs and sarcastically says good morning to the flowers. The flowers immediately hiss at him like snakes. Squidward screams and runs inside his house. SpongeBob decides that Squidward must have hay fever and says he'll do Squidward a kindness by planting him some hypoallergenic flowers. SpongeBob digs a hole and puts a flower in it, telling the flower it's on its way and that it must be thirsty. He turns around to grab his watering can, but when he turns back, the flower is half eaten. This happens repeatedly. SpongeBob plants a new flower, and when he turns to grab the watering can again, he sees the flower has been eaten once more. He plants another flower and this time declares he's not taking his eyes off it. His eyes stretch out to stare at the flower intensely. The French narrator announces that 3 days have passed. SpongeBob is still staring at the flower, but his eyes have shriveled up from dehydration. He uses the watering can to rehydrate his eyes. Patrick runs by and says hi to SpongeBob. SpongeBob turns around to greet Patrick, and when he turns back, the flower is eaten again. SpongeBob wonders out loud how this keeps happening. He then notices a seahorse eating the flower right next to him. SpongeBob says hi to the seahorse. The horse neighs and then gallops onto a rock. SpongeBob is immediately captivated and says she's beautiful. He says, "Wow," and then imagines himself riding the seahorse with a head full of wavy hair blowing in the wind. He declares she's a magnificent seahorse and that he shall tame her, wondering what they can accomplish together. The scene cuts to the seahorse eating some flowers, while SpongeBob watches from a distance and writes in a book. SpongeBob narrates that because of her mysterious behavior, he has decided to name her Mystery. He pauses and reconsiders, saying that now that he thinks about it, she is very graceful and majestic, so perhaps he should name her Grace or Majesty or Debbie instead. The seahorse neighs. SpongeBob realizes she must have spotted his floral bookmark, which he's using in his book. Mystery gallops over slowly towards SpongeBob. He encourages her, saying that's it, and not to be afraid, because he's just a talking sponge. Mystery sniffs the bookmark and then eats it. The episode shows a montage of SpongeBob and Mystery spending time together. SpongeBob rides with Mystery while blowing a bubble in the shape of a heart. They pose together for pictures. They make stamp books together. They walk out of a store laughing while wearing matching hats. The scene cuts to nighttime in SpongeBob's bedroom. SpongeBob is sleeping on the floor while Mystery is in SpongeBob's bed. SpongeBob tells Mystery that was the greatest day of his life. He asks if she thinks they'll be friends forever. Mystery is already asleep. SpongeBob says he'll take that as a yes. The episode establishes that it is now morning on the third day of their relationship. Squidward is riding his bike to work. SpongeBob and Mystery gallop past him. Squidward says, "What the?" in confusion. SpongeBob greets Squidward and says he's still riding to work on the machine. Squidward tells himself not to say anything and to remember his karma. Suddenly, his bike's front wheel falls off and he gets thrown from the bike. He tumbles down a cliff and then explodes. He groans in pain. SpongeBob arrives at the Krusty Krab and ties Mystery to a bike rack. He tells her to whoa and says she should wait out here until he's done with work, explaining he'll see her at the end of his shift. SpongeBob walks into the Krusty Krab as two fish named Scooter and Wobbles walk by outside. Scooter points at Mystery and says Mr. Krabs put in a kiddie ride. Wobbles speaks in a southern accent and suggests Scooter should try it out. Scooter gets out a quarter and looks at Mystery. He says he can't find the coin slot, then announces he's found it. Scooter puts his quarter into what he thinks is the coin slot on Mystery. Mystery whinnies and then bucks Scooter into the background where he explodes. Wobbles runs off screaming in his southern drawl that there's a kiddie ride on the loose. Mr. Krabs walks outside and asks what's with all the ruckus. He gasps and points at Mystery as she stands there innocently idle. Mr. Krabs calls her a monster that's scaring away his customers. SpongeBob corrects him and says that's not a monster but a horse. He explains she's his friend and her name is Mystery. Mr. Krabs responds by telling SpongeBob that he's the Mystery. SpongeBob laughs. Mr. Krabs tells him to get rid of the horse. SpongeBob stops laughing and says, "Huh?" He begs Mr. Krabs to let her stay and promises she won't hurt nobody no how. Mr. Krabs gives SpongeBob an ultimatum, saying it's either SpongeBob or Mystery who has to go. SpongeBob says he knew he should have named her Debbie instead. The scene cuts to SpongeBob sadly, grilling patties in the kitchen. Mr. Krabs thanks SpongeBob for finally getting rid of that horse. SpongeBob responds in a sad voice that Mr. Krabs is welcome. Mr. Krabs says now if they could just get rid of Squidward and laughs. He walks out. SpongeBob says, "Good one, sir," and then takes off a pair of sad eyes, like they're contact lenses. He laughs and says it worked. He opens a cabinet to reveal Mystery hiding inside. SpongeBob tells her he'll just keep her in there until Patrick finishes building that stable he asked him to build. The scene cuts to Patrick sitting down with a board on his forehead, doing absolutely nothing. SpongeBob says only 8 more hours and closes the cupboards. The French narrator announces that 12 seconds have passed. Mystery peeks out of the cupboard. SpongeBob tells her no, and that she can't come out yet. He whispers that if Old Man Krabs sees her, he'll lose his job. SpongeBob gives her a tray with a patty on it and says he bets she's hungry, offering her some lunch. Mystery eats the patty and neighs loudly. SpongeBob looks around quickly to make sure no one heard Mystery. He tells her to shush and that she's got to be quiet. Mr. Krabs suddenly bursts into the kitchen asking what that sound was and if the horse is in there. SpongeBob quickly closes the cabinet and tells Mr. Krabs no, explaining he was just doing his imitation of Mystery. SpongeBob makes a wheeze-gnaw sound. Mr. Krabs tells him to keep working on it because that imitation was terrible. Mr. Krabs walks out. SpongeBob says that was close and grabs a tray with 3 patties on it. He announces from now on there will be no more hijinks and calls out, "Order up," as he puts the tray on the window. Mystery immediately eats the patties from the tray. Squidward walks up to the window and makes a confused sound. He asks SpongeBob where his order is. SpongeBob suggests Squidward should look under the tray. Squidward says, "Oh no, he didn't," and apologizes. He looks under the tray and sighs, then asks SpongeBob if he could just get the order. SpongeBob says the patties vanished. He starts trembling and asks Squidward if he thinks the Krusty Krab is haunted. SpongeBob worries about what will happen if they come for him next. He bites his fingernails in fear and says he's got to get out of there. He runs toward the door, but Squidward stops him. Squidward tells SpongeBob there are no ghosts. SpongeBob calms down and says, "Oh." Squidward begins explaining how things work at the restaurant. While Squidward talks, Mystery approaches a customer's Krabby Patty on a table. Squidward explains that he orders the food, SpongeBob cooks the food, then the customer gets the food. SpongeBob notices Mystery approaching the customer's table. Squidward continues talking, saying they do this for 40 years and then they die. SpongeBob's eyes move to the side of his face as he watches Mystery. Squidward asks if that sounds like a pretty good deal and what SpongeBob says. Mystery eats the Krabby Patty and burps. SpongeBob tells Squidward yeah, he hears him and will be right back. SpongeBob grabs Mystery and shoves her under a cupboard. Squidward asks what that was. SpongeBob tells him not to tell Mr. Krabs and that he's got it all under control. He closes the cupboard. SpongeBob asks Squidward what he was saying. Squidward just tells him to get the order and walks out. SpongeBob says Squidward's got it and chuckles about the ghost idea. Mystery then eats SpongeBob's Krusty Krab work hat. SpongeBob says Mystery ate his hat. Mystery belches out a chewed-up spatula. SpongeBob gasps and says Mystery ate his spatula. He approaches empty Krabby Patty boxes and realizes she ate all the Krabby Patties. He approaches the half-eaten stove and sees she ate the stove. SpongeBob approaches an empty wheelchair and realizes Mystery ate Old Man Jenkins. A voice from inside Mystery's belly says he doesn't want to be a burden. The episode transcript identifies this character as Old Man Walker rather than Old Man Jenkins, which is an important factual detail. Squidward stands at the front with customers yelling complaints. He tells the folks they have a minor situation going on in the kitchen. A customer named Thaddeus asks where their food is. Fred says he's so hungry. A customer named Tina says this is her only lunch hour. Tom asks where Old Man Jenkins is. Squidward tells them to take it easy and adds that the food's no good there anyway. Mr. Krabs asks Squidward what's going on. Squidward suggests Mr. Krabs should go ask Cowbob Ranch Pants and his faithful companion Sir Eats-a-Lot. These nicknames Squidward creates for SpongeBob and Mystery show his frustration with the situation. Mr. Krabs runs into the kitchen and asks SpongeBob what's the meaning of all these nicknames. His eyes bulge in shock when he sees what's happening. Mr. Krabs shouts, "David H. Jones!" which appears to be his version of an exclamation. SpongeBob is standing by Mystery's side, and Mystery has clearly eaten too much. SpongeBob explains that Mystery got a bellyache from eating Krabby Patties, so he made her a bicarbonate of soda. Mystery belches out Old Man Walker, who asks what he missed. Mr. Krabs' eyes stand stiff and look similar to sewing pins. After staring blankly, he takes out his eyes, blows on them, rubs them, and puts them back in to make sure he's seeing correctly. Mr. Krabs confirms his eyes are correct, and that SpongeBob still has the horse even after being ordered to get rid of it. He announces he's going to get rid of Mystery once and for all. SpongeBob begs Mr. Krabs not to make him give up Mystery. He says he knows Mr. Krabs thinks she's just a horse, but she's more than that. SpongeBob explains that Mystery listens to him and understands everything he says, and that he understands her too. He declares she's his best friend. Mystery licks SpongeBob's cheek affectionately. Squidward suddenly starts sobbing, but it turns out there's a bowl of onions near him causing him to cry. Squidward asks who left the bowl of onions there. Mr. Krabs tells SpongeBob that his story has touched his heart. He says that, believe it or not, he knows what it's like to give up a best friend. SpongeBob sniffles and asks if Mr. Krabs really does understand. Mr. Krabs begins telling a story about when he was 5 years old and his father gave him $1. He says he loved that dollar and loved it like a brother. He and that dollar went everywhere together. SpongeBob asks what happened to the dollar. Mr. Krabs sniffles and explains that one day at the beach it was so hot and he was so thirsty that he spent the dollar on a soda. Mr. Krabs starts sobbing and saying, "My best friend," while crying. Squidward sobs again because of the onions and asks if the bowl would get out of there. Mr. Krabs makes his point by telling SpongeBob that sometimes you have to set things free, even though it's hard. He points at Mystery and says to look at her. Mr. Krabs says Mystery misses the great outdoors, the wide open spaces, and the rolling green pastures. He declares that the kitchen is no place for a live horse. 2 customers spit out their patties in disgust at this revelation. SpongeBob says all right and that he understands. A customer named Nat Peterson starts sobbing because Squidward is holding the bowl of onions under his nose. Nat says, "Hey," in protest. SpongeBob takes Mystery outside and tells her she's free to go. He takes Mystery's leash off. SpongeBob cries and says he can't keep her anymore. He tells Mystery he knows it's hard for her to understand, but Mr. Krabs is right, and she belongs in the wild. Mystery gallops a short distance away. SpongeBob asks what she's waiting for and says she can't see that he doesn't want her anymore. He's now crying much harder. Patrick walks up in the background with the board still on his head. SpongeBob tells Mystery to just get out of there and calls her a stupid, dumb animal. He continues crying intensely. Patrick walks away. Mr. Krabs walks up to SpongeBob. SpongeBob says, Mystery is gone and he'll never see her again. Mr. Krabs tells him it's okay and that he did the proper thing. He says Mystery is free now and they have no right to separate that wild animal from its natural habitat. Squidward suddenly calls out to Mr. Krabs and says it looks like old Mystery had an after-dinner salad. The vault of money opens to show dollar bills that have been eaten and a bunch of money is missing. Mr. Krabs immediately yells, "Get that horse!" and he and SpongeBob run after Mystery. SpongeBob calls out, "Mystery, you who?" Mr. Krabs yells for Mystery to come back. SpongeBob tries calling Mystery again and then attempts his wheeze-naw imitation. Both of them yell for Mystery to come back. The scene cuts to Patrick, who still has the board attached to his head. He's trying to enter a hat shop, but the board keeps bumping on the sides of the entrance repeatedly. The screen fades to black and the episode ends. Mystery the Seahorse never appeared in another SpongeBob episode after My Pretty Seahorse, making her a true one-episode character despite her significant impact on SpongeBob during their brief time together. The episode used Mystery as a vehicle to explore SpongeBob's tendency to become deeply attached to things quickly, and his difficulty in recognizing when his attachments create problems for others. Mystery herself displayed typical horse behavior throughout the episode, eating constantly and causing destruction without any malicious intent. The episode never showed Mystery as having human-level intelligence or the ability to understand complex concepts. She simply acted like a regular horse would act, eating everything in sight because that's what horses do. SpongeBob interpreted her actions through the lens of his own emotions and projected a deep friendship onto what was essentially just a wild animal that tolerated his presence because he kept providing food. The character of Mystery worked effectively because she created practical problems that couldn't be solved through SpongeBob's usual optimism or enthusiasm. Mr. Krabs' concerns about keeping a horse in the restaurant were completely valid, and Mystery proved him right by eating everything including customers. The episode's ending, where Mystery eats Mr. Krabs' money, provided a perfect reversal of the emotional goodbye scene and showed that sometimes practical concerns should outweigh emotional attachments. Mystery, the seahorse, remains one of the most memorable animal characters from early SpongeBob, despite only appearing once, demonstrating how effective the show's writers were at creating impactful characters, even for single episodes. Before we move on, Make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Flats the Flounder. The Bully. Flats the Flounder. The Bully. Flats the Flounder stands as one of the most memorable antagonists in SpongeBob SquarePants history, despite appearing in only one episode from Season 3, titled The Bully, which aired on October 5th, 2001. The character became iconic because of his simple yet terrifying motivation and the episode's exploration of how fear and anxiety can dominate someone's life even when the actual threat turns out to be harmless. Flats represents a specific type of bully character that the show examined during its early seasons. Someone whose intimidation comes purely from verbal threats and physical presence, rather than any complex scheming or manipulation. The episode uses Flats to create comedy from SpongeBob's escalating paranoia, while also delivering a surprising twist ending that subverts typical bully storylines. Unlike most one-episode characters who simply exist as background elements, Flats drives the entire narrative and creates genuine tension despite the show's typically lighthearted tone. The episode begins at Mrs. Puff's boating school, where students are arriving for class. SpongeBob is loudly arranging his pencils on his desk. A female student tells him she doesn't want to have to report him again. SpongeBob was just wondering about something related to his pencils. He has 3 pencils labeled homework, quiz, and essay. He asks whether the homework pencil goes on the left side of the paper next to the quiz pencil, or over on the right side all by itself. The student starts to respond, but SpongeBob interrupts, saying he's got it. He explains that the quiz pencil goes right over next to the essay pencil, and the essay pencil gets turned sideways toward the notepad just in case he has to write an essay. Mrs. Puff walks into the classroom and apologizes for being late. She says she got caught in traffic on the way there when that whole "I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life" thing reared its ugly head. Everyone stares at her blankly. Mrs. Puff announces they have a new student starting today and tells the class to put on a happy face for Flats the Flounder. She opens the door to reveal the new student. Flats appears skinny when viewed from the front, but when he turns sideways, he's revealed to be very large and wide. The entire class except SpongeBob starts clapping while wearing colorful, smiling masks. Mrs. Puff asks Flats to tell the class something about himself. Flats responds by saying he likes to kick people's butts. Mrs. Puff laughs and calls him a card. She tells Flats it's time to pick his seat and says he can sit anywhere he likes. The entire class quickly moves their desks away from the middle of the room. SpongeBob is the only student who doesn't move his desk. Flats sits in the empty seat next to SpongeBob. Mrs. Puff begins teaching the class. Her voice gets drowned out as she talks about what they started the previous week. SpongeBob turns to Flats and introduces himself, saying, "Hi, I'm SpongeBob." Flats responds by introducing himself and immediately telling SpongeBob he's going to kick his butt. SpongeBob gasps and then laughs, saying that joke was almost funnier the second time. Flats leans over SpongeBob menacingly and says, "No, I mean it." SpongeBob giggles and says that time it almost seemed like Flats really meant it. Flats then rips off his chest hair to show a tattoo that says, "I mean it." SpongeBob is horror-struck by this display. He raises his hand and asks Mrs. Puff if he can be excused for the rest of his life. Mrs. Puff chuckles and says no, explaining that she's in the middle of a coffee-fueled sermon right now and SpongeBob can't afford to miss this information. SpongeBob puts his hand down and apologizes to Mrs. Puff. Mrs. Puff asks for a volunteer to come up to the board and calls on Flats. She tells him to draw a diagram of a basic 4-way intersection. Flats draws something on the board. Mrs. Puff asks him to turn and show the class what he drew. Flats has drawn pictures of SpongeBob being beat up. SpongeBob yelps in horror. Mrs. Puff says how very creative and announces they have an artist in the class. Everyone applauds except SpongeBob. The scene transitions with a bubble to SpongeBob running through the halls and into the bathroom. He hides in one of the toilets. SpongeBob says he just doesn't understand why Flats would want to kick his butt, claiming he hasn't said 2 words to the guy. The scene cuts back to SpongeBob's introduction, where he said, "Hi, I'm SpongeBob." SpongeBob counts on his fingers and realizes that was actually 3 words, not 2. He gasps and wonders what he's going to do. SpongeBob hears the bathroom door open and asks what that sound was. He says someone's coming and they're getting closer. SpongeBob decides he's just got to act natural. Another student opens the toilet stall lid and sees what appears to be a real sponge floating in the toilet. The student says, "Oh, that's real nice," and walks out. SpongeBob says, "Phew," and mentions he thought for sure that was going to be Flats. Flats then opens the stall. SpongeBob greets him and asks if he's kicked any good butts lately. SpongeBob starts rambling about how last week he was kicking some guy's butt real good, and the guy leaned over and said life's like a bucket of wood shavings, except when the shavings are in a pail, then it's like a pail of wood shavings. SpongeBob giggles. Flats looks dumbfounded. Flats says that story really speaks to him. SpongeBob asks what it says. Flats responds that it says now he's going to kick SpongeBob's butt twice as hard. Flats leaves and SpongeBob flushes the toilet, making water spray out of his holes. The scene transitions to SpongeBob walking down the hall while writing on a clipboard. SpongeBob appears to be writing his will, mentioning he's leaving Gary's water bowl to Gary and his curtains to someone else. He says he just can't do this. The school phone rings and SpongeBob picks it up saying, "Death row, next in line speaking." Patrick is on the other end trying to place an order for delivery. He asks for a large double olive pizza. SpongeBob realizes it's Patrick and asks if that's really him. The scene cuts to Patrick's rock where Patrick is on the phone. Patrick says yeah and calls someone Mario, asking for a large double olive pizza. The scene cuts back to SpongeBob, who tells Patrick to listen because it's him, SpongeBob, and he needs help. Patrick asks if SpongeBob is working at Pizza Castle now. SpongeBob says what? No, and explains he's in big trouble. SpongeBob tells Patrick there's a new guy at school who wants to kick his butt. He asks Patrick, who is big and strong, if he could come down and maybe rough the guy up a bit, just to get him off SpongeBob's back. SpongeBob says please, and that he's so scared it feels like he's going to throw up. Patrick responds by saying something about olives. SpongeBob asks if Patrick is still there. Patrick apologizes and says he was just talking to his old community, college buddy, Flats. SpongeBob is horror-struck. The scene cuts to Patrick's rock where Flats is sitting on the couch enjoying a beverage. Patrick says he bumped into Flats at the soda store and asks if that's funny. Patrick mentions it must have been years since they've seen each other. Patrick says he needs to get going because Flats has to go back to school soon, adding that Flats says he's got to kick somebody's butt. SpongeBob drops the phone and runs away screaming. Patrick asks hello and wonders if this is Pizza Castle. The scene cuts to Mrs. Puff's classroom where SpongeBob's screaming is still heard. He smashes into the door. Mrs. Puff tells SpongeBob to come in. SpongeBob asks if he can be in a different class. Mrs. Puff asks why. SpongeBob says he can't tell her. Mrs. Puff asks why not. SpongeBob insists he just can't, and that his physical being is at stake, suggesting they leave it at that. Mrs. Puff tells SpongeBob he can tell her anything, and that he's got to believe that. SpongeBob says okay, but only if she promises to keep it between them. Mrs. Puff says, of course. SpongeBob tells her that Flats says he's going to kick his butt. Mrs. Puff responds by saying what and declaring there shall be no butt kicking in any class of hers because this is an adult program. She tells SpongeBob to just leave it to her. SpongeBob thanks her and says he knew he could count on her. The scene transitions to SpongeBob eating a sandwich outside for lunch. The bell rings and everyone goes back into the classroom. Mrs. Puff asks if SpongeBob had a nice lunch and walks into the classroom. SpongeBob says yes. Mrs. Puff whispers to SpongeBob that she talked to Flats for him and used SpongeBob's name. SpongeBob's face drops. Mrs. Puff says it was all a misunderstanding. SpongeBob is shocked and asks what she did. Mrs. Puff explains that Flats was never going to kick SpongeBob's butt at all. She tells SpongeBob that Flats is from a town where kicking someone's butt means he wants to be your friend and maybe play some sports on weekends. In the background, Flats makes a sand sculpture of SpongeBob and kicks it over. SpongeBob watches in horror. SpongeBob nervously says he's got diarrhea and runs off. SpongeBob sees an older flounder in a boat and asks if he's Flat's dad. The older flounder confirms that yes, he is. SpongeBob explains he didn't know where else to turn, saying Patrick couldn't help him and Mrs. Puff only made it worse. SpongeBob tells him that he sits next to his son Flats in school and that Flats is a fine boy, but he doesn't want the father to take this the wrong way because Flats wants to kick his butt. Flats suddenly appears by the boat and asks his dad what he's doing. The father nervously says nothing. Flats asks what he told him about talking to strangers. Flats' father tells SpongeBob in a frightened voice that now Flats is going to kick his butt too. This reveals that even Flats' own father is afraid of him and his butt-kicking threats. SpongeBob screams in horror and runs away through the whole town. He yells for people to get out of his way and points behind him, asking if they can't see Flats is going to kick his butt. A bunch of fish look over to an older fish named Lonnie, who is standing at a bus stop. Lonnie greets them and comments that it's a nice day. A fish named Harold asks Lonnie if he likes kicking butts and says they'll show him. The fish start beating up Lonnie while SpongeBob hides in a garbage can. This scene shows how SpongeBob's panic about butt kicking has caused an innocent bystander to get attacked due to a misunderstanding. SpongeBob says he's got to skip town, start a new life, and live under an assumed name. He comes up with Bob Pants Sponge Square and says that's good. He plans to grow a beard and then shave it off and live happily ever after. Flats appears behind him driving a garbage truck. Flats says SpongeBob forgot the part where he kicks his butt. SpongeBob gasps 3 times and runs off while still in the garbage can, with Flats chasing him. As SpongeBob runs down the road, trash falls out of the garbage can and Flats chuckles. A banana peel falls out of the garbage can. Flats sees the banana peel on the ground and screams while attempting to slow down, but the dump truck runs over the peel. The truck flips upside down and crushes Flats. The scene cuts to later where Flats is covered with a cast on his entire body while lying in a bed at the hospital. SpongeBob visits and asks Flats if he's feeling better. Flats asks what happened and where he is. A doctor walks in and explains that Flats is in the hospital and that the young boy saved his life. The doctor says SpongeBob performed CPR for 5 hours straight. SpongeBob confirms this and says they told him Flats would be okay after the first few minutes, but he just wanted to be sure. Flats says wow, and that he's touched. He adds that he'll have to remember that when he's kicking SpongeBob's butt. SpongeBob is thunderstruck, accompanied by a glass-shattering sound effect. Flats asks if the flowers are for him. SpongeBob screams and runs out of the hospital, yelling that Flats is still going to kick his butt. The fish see Lonnie at the bus stop again. Harold asks how many times they have to teach the old man this lesson. Lonnie says he loves the young people. The angry fish walk up to Lonnie, suggesting they're about to beat him up again. The scene cuts to SpongeBob running back to his house while screaming. He tells Gary he's too young to have his butt kicked and that there are so many things in life he hasn't gotten to do. The scene cuts to SpongeBob in an office building at a desk, on the phone, saying he'll transfer a call. This brief scene appears to show one of the things SpongeBob apparently wanted to experience before getting his butt kicked. The scene cuts back to SpongeBob's house, where there's a knock on the door. SpongeBob asks who it is. The door gets kicked down. SpongeBob sees Flats and screams his name. Flats announces it's butt-kicking time. SpongeBob tells Gary there's something he wants him to know, but he's too scared to remember what it is. Flats cracks his knuckles with his hands and then uses a nutcracker. SpongeBob breathes harder and harder. Flats brushes his teeth and gargles. SpongeBob continues breathing harder. Flats says, "Let's do it." SpongeBob tells Gary to go away because he doesn't want him to see this, warning it'll be ugly. Gary pulls out a camera from his shell, apparently planning to photograph the event. Flats asks if SpongeBob is ready. SpongeBob says to hold on and puts a blindfold over his eyes. He says, okay, he's ready now. Flats punches SpongeBob, but the fist harmlessly compresses SpongeBob's body. SpongeBob says he's ready. Flats tries again, but the same result happens. SpongeBob asks if Flats didn't hear him say he was ready. Flats punches him again, and this time SpongeBob giggles, saying that tickled. Flats keeps punching SpongeBob, but nothing seems to hurt him. SpongeBob realizes what's happening and tells Gary he's absorbing Flats' blows like he was made of some kind of spongy material. SpongeBob asks if Gary knows what this means and celebrates that he gets to go to work tomorrow. The scene cuts to the next day where SpongeBob is in the Krusty Krab kitchen grilling patties while Flats is still desperately punching him. The scene then cuts to SpongeBob playing cards with Gary. SpongeBob asks if Gary has any sevens. Gary meows in response. The episode shows a montage of SpongeBob going about his daily life while Flats continues punching him. SpongeBob is shown chasing jellyfish, walking out of the bathroom, sleeping in his bed, and eating breakfast, all while Flats keeps punching without causing any damage. The scene cuts back to boating school, where SpongeBob is sitting at his desk and Flats is still punching him. Flats finally passes out from exhaustion. SpongeBob asks if Flats is okay. Everyone in the class cheers. SpongeBob tells them not to cheer him and calls them his fellow adult classmates. He says Flats was the real victim here, a victim of a society that's riding down a violent road to nowhere. SpongeBob clenches his fist and says it's a road he calls Violence Road. Mrs. Puff walks into the classroom and apologizes for being late. She gasps when she sees SpongeBob's clenched fist and Flats lying on the ground. Mrs. Puff says she can't believe SpongeBob beat up a new student. The camera zooms out of the school. Mrs. Puff declares she's going to kick SpongeBob's butt, which creates an ironic ending where SpongeBob now faces the same threat from his teacher that he spent the entire episode fearing from Flats. Flats the Flounder serves as an excellent example of how SpongeBob SquarePants created memorable antagonists through simple but effective character design and motivation. Flats has no complex backstory or elaborate evil plan. His entire character revolves around his single-minded determination to kick SpongeBob's butt, which he announces repeatedly throughout the episode. The physical comedy of Flats being skinny from the front but wide from the side adds to his intimidating presence while also being visually humorous. The episode uses Flats to explore themes of anxiety and how fear can consume someone's entire life even when the actual threat may not be as dangerous as perceived. SpongeBob spends the entire episode in escalating panic, trying every possible solution from hiding to seeking help from authority figures to attempting to flee town. The reveal that Patrick knows Flats from community college adds another layer of irony to the situation, as SpongeBob's best friend unknowingly socializes with his tormentor. The fact that even Flats' own father is afraid of him suggests this is an established pattern of behavior rather than something specific to SpongeBob. The episode's ending delivers a perfect twist by revealing that SpongeBob's spongy body naturally absorbs Flats' punches, rendering the entire threat harmless. Flats punches himself to exhaustion, while SpongeBob goes about his daily life completely unaffected, which subverts the traditional bully story where the victim must either fight back or find a way to outsmart the antagonist. Instead, SpongeBob's natural physical properties solve the problem without him even trying. The final irony of Mrs. Puff threatening to kick SpongeBob's butt creates a circular ending that suggests the cycle of threats and fear will continue regardless of the previous resolution. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the hash-slinging slasher, graveyard shift. The hash-slinging slasher, graveyard shift. The hash-slinging slasher represents one of the most memorable fictional characters within the SpongeBob SquarePants universe, despite being completely made up by Squidward during the Season 2 episode Graveyard Shift, which aired on September 6, 2002. Unlike most characters discussed in this series who actually exist in the show's world, the hash-slinging slasher is a ghost story that Squidward invents on the spot to frighten SpongeBob during their first night shift at the Krusty Krab. The character became one of the most iconic elements of what many fans consider to be one of the greatest SpongeBob episodes ever created. The hash-slinging slasher works as a character concept because it taps into classic horror movie tropes and urban legend structures while existing in the colorful, cartoonish world of Bikini Bottom. The episode uses this invented ghost story to create genuine suspense and comedy, demonstrating how effective the show's writers were at balancing different tones within a single episode. The episode begins at night at the Krusty Krab during closing time. The French narrator describes the Krusty Krab as Bikini Bottom's premier daytime eatery where it will be closing time right about now. Squidward switches the sign from open to closed and announces it's 8 o'clock. He takes off his Krusty Krab employee hat and says so long to the suckers, explaining he's got a hot date with a little lady whose name is Clarinet. He pulls out his clarinet. A customer named Tom shows up at the door and knocks, causing Squidward to drop his clarinet. Squidward asks what Tom wants. Tom asks if they're open. Squidward points to the sign telling him to read it. Tom ignores him and says he'll have a Krabby Patty Deluxe and double chili kelp fries. Squidward refuses and says he can't hang out there all night because he's got a life. Tom says fine, and that if they don't want his money, he'll leave. Mr. Krabs immediately falls from the ceiling onto Squidward when he hears the word money. Mr. Krabs asks Tom if he means that if they stayed open later, Tom would give them his money. Tom pulls out cash and says sure. More customers appear behind him. Mr. Krabs tears up the closed sign and welcomes Squidward to the night shift. He announces that from now on, the Krusty Krab is open 24 hours a day. Squidward asks, "What?" And a crowd of fish barge in cheering and trample over him. SpongeBob gasps and says, "Wow, now they never have to stop working." Squidward gets up and tries to protest to Mr. Krabs. Mr. Krabs tells them he'll see them in the morning and that he can't hang out there all night because he's got a life. He leaves. Squidward calls after Mr. Krabs. SpongeBob asks if this isn't great and says it'll be just him and Squidward together for hours and hours, and then the sun will come up and it'll be tomorrow and they'll still be working. SpongeBob gasps and says it'll be just like a sleepover, except they'll be sweaty and covered with grease. He asks if Squidward is ready to rock. Squidward says no. SpongeBob says good because they've got customers. The episode shows SpongeBob enthusiastically performing his regular duties while constantly pointing out that he's doing them at night. He tells Squidward he's working in the kitchen at night. He announces he's chopping lettuce at night. He says he's swabbing the bathroom at night. When he burns his hand on the grill, he screams and then adds at night. He walks around singing night, 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 repeatedly to the tune of the Charge fanfare, ending with a very loud night. Squidward shouts at SpongeBob asking if he'll please stop. He hands SpongeBob a bag of garbage and tells him to give him a moment's peace and take out the trash. SpongeBob says all right and announces he's taking out the trash at night. He stops at the door and stares at the dumpster outside in the dark. SpongeBob asks Squidward if he means outside. Squidward confirms that's where the dumpster is. SpongeBob says he doesn't know because it's kind of dark out there. He leans his face against the window. Squidward points out he thought SpongeBob liked the night shift. SpongeBob says, Squidward is right. He lifts the bag over his head and shouts, "For the Krusty Krab!" He runs out of the building to the dumpster while screaming and panicking the whole way. He re-enters the building panting heavily, then snaps his fingers and confidently says it was a piece of cake. Squidward asks if SpongeBob is not afraid. SpongeBob walks past Squidward and says, "Pfft, nah." Squidward says, well, he is afraid, especially after, and then he looks around, gulps, and says, "You know." SpongeBob stops and turns around asking what he knows. Squidward asks if SpongeBob doesn't remember and says it was all over the news. SpongeBob begs him to tell him. Squidward says no, and that he probably shouldn't, because it would ruin the night shift for SpongeBob. He gives a sympathetic look and then smiles slyly. SpongeBob excitedly asks what happened repeatedly. This is the moment when Squidward decides to invent the hash-slinging slasher story. Squidward asks SpongeBob if he's never heard the story of the hash-slinging slasher. The way Squidward pauses before saying the name shows he's making it up as he goes. SpongeBob asks in confusion if he means the slash-bringing hasher. Squidward corrects him saying, the hash-slinging slasher. SpongeBob tries again but mangles the name into the sash-ringing, the trash-singing, mash-flinging, the flash-springing, ringing, the crash dinging. These mispronunciations became some of the most quoted lines from the entire series. Squidward confirms yes, the hash-slinging slasher, but adds that most people just call him the Ha, and then breaks into a scream. He explains that's all they have time to say before the hash-slinging slasher gets them. SpongeBob begs Squidward to tell him the story. Squidward begins narrating that years ago at this very restaurant, the hash-slinging slasher used to be a fry cook just like SpongeBob, only clumsier. He says that one night, when the hash-slinging slasher was cutting the patties, it happened. SpongeBob guesses he forgot the secret sauce. Squidward says no. SpongeBob guesses he didn't wash his hands. Squidward says no again. SpongeBob guesses irregular portions. Squidward says no and reveals that the hash-slinging slasher cut off his own hand by mistake. SpongeBob asks if he means like this and pulls one of his arms out of its socket. Another arm grows back in its place. SpongeBob keeps doing this repeatedly, pulling his arms off and having them regrow. Squidward interrupts him saying, "Except he wasn't a sponge." SpongeBob asks, "So?" with all his extra hands creating a rainbow-like line. Squidward explains it didn't grow back. SpongeBob screams, "Oh no!" and all his extra arms lift their hands upward and run away off his body. Squidward continues the story, explaining that the hash-slinging slasher replaced his hand with a rusty spatula. Then he got hit by a bus. Squidward adds that at his funeral, they fired him. Squidward asks what day it is. SpongeBob says Tuesday. Squidward dramatically announces that every Tuesday night, the hash-slinging slasher's ghost returns to the Krusty Krab to wreak his horrible vengeance. SpongeBob gasps and realizes tonight is Tuesday night. Squidward confirms that means the hash-slinging slasher will be coming. SpongeBob asks how they'll know. Squidward explains there are 3 signs that signal the approach of the hash-slinging slasher. First, the lights will flicker on and off. A customer named Harold interrupts asking if he can have some ketchup. Squidward hands him a ketchup packet and continues. Next, the phone will ring, and there will be nobody there. The camera shows SpongeBob eating his fingernails nervously. Squidward says finally, the hash-slinging slasher arrives in the ghost of the bus that ran him over. The camera shows SpongeBob eating his fingernails, then starting to eat his arms which regrow, and he eats those too. Squidward continues that the hash-slinging slasher exits the bus and crosses the street without looking both ways because he's already dead. SpongeBob begins eating his hands like popcorn. Squidward adds that the hash-slinging slasher taps on the window with his grisly spatula hand. SpongeBob says no. Squidward says he opens the door and pushes his tentacle to SpongeBob's face, while imitating the sound of a creaky door opening. SpongeBob's face sinks in as Squidward leans toward it. Squidward says the hash-slinging slasher slowly approaches the counter. The word counter echoes menacingly. Squidward asks if SpongeBob knows what the hash-slinging slasher does next. SpongeBob asks what. Squidward asks if he really wants to know. SpongeBob asks what again. Squidward asks if he's sure he wants to know. SpongeBob desperately asks what the hash-slinging slasher does. Squidward sneaks up on SpongeBob and then taps him saying, "He gets ya!" SpongeBob screams repeatedly for about 20 seconds while Squidward laughs. Everyone in the restaurant stares at SpongeBob in confusion and concern. Squidward eventually stops laughing. He tries to tell SpongeBob he was joking, but SpongeBob keeps screaming. Squidward attempts several times to explain, but SpongeBob won't stop. SpongeBob's pupils start screaming too, which causes Squidward to lose his temper. Squidward finally shouts that he was joking. SpongeBob asks what? Squidward explains it's not true, and none of it's true. SpongeBob asks if it's not. Squidward says of course not, and that nobody has a spatula for a hand. He confirms it was all a joke. SpongeBob says oh, and then starts laughing repeatedly, the same way he was screaming, much to Squidward's annoyance. The scene cuts to later in the night. A big sign outside the Krusty Krab says, "Open forever." Squidward is shown at the register boat reading a book. He hears spooky noises and the sound of water dripping and looks around nervously. SpongeBob is on the ceiling wearing suction cups while cleaning. He asks if this isn't great because there's never time to wash the ceiling during the day. Squidward screams. He says to himself that being open 24 hours a day is a stupid idea and asks who wants a Krabby Patty at 3 in the morning. The scene cuts to Patrick's bedroom where his alarm clock goes off. Patrick turns off the alarm and says, "Oh boy, 3 a.m. He whips out a Krabby Patty from under his blanket and starts eating it. This brief scene provides comic relief while also showing that Mr. Krabs' decision to stay open 24 hours actually does have customers. The scene cuts back to the Krusty Krab. Squidward says to just look at this place and that it's like a ghost town in there. The lights start to flicker on and off. Squidward sarcastically says, "Very funny, SpongeBob." SpongeBob asks, "What?" Squidward says, "And the lights will flicker on and off, just like the story. I get it." He then realizes no one is actually flickering the light switch and looks shocked. SpongeBob asks how Squidward is doing that without moving the switch. Squidward says he's not doing it and that it must be the stupid faulty wiring. He explains this place isn't built to run 24 hours a day. The phone rings. Squidward picks it up asking, What, hello?" He keeps saying hello but gets no response. SpongeBob walks up to the register boat and says, "Nice try, Squidward." Squidward asks, "Nice try what?" SpongeBob quotes Squidward's earlier story about how the phone will ring and there will be no one there. He raises his eyebrows up and down and giggles, saying Squidward cracks him up. Squidward insists he's not doing this. He hangs up the phone and tells himself to calm down. Squidward tries to remember what the signs were. He says there was the lights, which flicker on and off. Then the phone, which rings again. Squidward then asks if the walls will ooze green slime. The walls start to ooze green slime. Squidward says, "Oh wait, they always do that." He wonders what that third thing was. He hears a motor sound, turns his head and opens, his eyes wide. A bus pulls up to the Krusty Krab doors. SpongeBob walks up to the register boat and says he didn't know the buses ran this late. Squidward says they don't. The bus pulls away, dropping off a man on the opposite side of the street. All Squidward and SpongeBob can see is the person's spooky outline. SpongeBob says, "Well, they're dropping someone off." From the outside, the man lifts his spatula. Squidward screams in terror so intensely that hair grows from his head and starts wiggling. Squidward stutters trying to say the name, calling it the sash ringing, flash singing, the bash pinging. SpongeBob identifies it as the hash slinging slasher and starts to cry. Squidward says, "At last you understand," and that they're doomed. SpongeBob says no, that's not it. He wipes a tear and says he's just so touched that Squidward would go through the trouble to dress up as a ghostly fry cook and stand on the other side of the street just to entertain him. SpongeBob says Squidward must really like him and cries again. Squidward points out there are two problems with SpongeBob's theory. One, he hates SpongeBob. And two, how can that be Squidward when he's standing right here? The man taps on the door with his spatula. SpongeBob screams in terror so intensely that his eyelashes grow and start wiggling. SpongeBob and Squidward both yell, "The hash-slinging slasher." The man walks in the door and up to the counter. SpongeBob and Squidward hold each other in terror. Squidward screams. SpongeBob yells to get away from him and that the hash-slinging slasher is going to flip him. Squidward tells SpongeBob that no matter what he said, he's always sort of liked him. SpongeBob confesses that he used Squidward's clarinet to unclog his toilet. Squidward says, "Huh," in shock. SpongeBob keeps yelling for the person to get away and that he's not welcome there. The person reaches the register boat and steps into the light, revealing himself to be a green little man in a purple coat. The character is identified in the transcript as Richard. Richard asks if he can have a job application. He says he brought his own spatula and holds it up. His sleeve rolls down his arm to show he has his hand attached. Richard mentions he called earlier but hung up because he was nervous. SpongeBob asks if he has references. Squidward lets go of SpongeBob and says to wait. He asks if that was Richard on the phone and Richard on the bus. Then who was flickering the lights? The lights flicker on and off. SpongeBob, Squidward, and Richard look over and the camera shows a vampire named Nosferatu, who is flicking a giant light switch. SpongeBob, Squidward, and Richard all say, "Nosferatu," in a joking tone. Nosferatu smiles and turns the light off, ending the episode. The hash-slinging slasher, despite being completely fictional even within the show's universe, became one of the most memorable elements of early SpongeBob SquarePants. The character demonstrates how the show's writers could create effective horror comedy by building tension through classic ghost story structure while maintaining the series' signature humor. Squidward's improvised story follows traditional urban legend patterns with specific details like the hand being replaced by a rusty spatula, the irony of being fired at one's own funeral, and the 3 warning signs of the ghost's arrival. The episode cleverly uses these established horror tropes and then subverts them by having all 3 signs actually occur, but for completely mundane reasons. The lights flicker because of faulty wiring in a building not meant to run 24 hours. The phone rings with nobody there because Richard got nervous and hung up. The bus actually does run that late and drops off Richard, who happens to be carrying his own spatula and approaching the restaurant. The final reveal that Nosferatu was actually flickering the lights adds an absurdist twist that became another iconic moment from the episode. The hash slinging. Slasher represents how SpongeBob could take a simple concept and execute it with perfect timing, escalating tension, and unexpected humor that appealed to both children and adults watching the show. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the Alaskan bullworm. Sandy, SpongeBob, and the worm. The Alaskan bullworm. Sandy, SpongeBob, and the worm. The Alaskan bullworm stands as one of the most destructive and memorable antagonists in SpongeBob SquarePants history, appearing as the main threat in the Season 2 episode, Sandy, SpongeBob, and the Worm, which aired on October 12, 2001. Unlike most villains or antagonists in the series who have personalities, motivations, or the ability to speak, the Alaskan bullworm operates purely on instinct as a massive eating machine that consumes everything in its path. The creature represents a rare example of the show using genuine monster movie conventions to create tension and spectacle while maintaining its signature humor. The episode demonstrates how SpongeBob SquarePants could shift tones dramatically, moving from lighthearted comedy to something approaching actual horror when showing the scale and destructive power of this enormous creature. The Alaskan bullworm never appeared in another episode after this one, making it a true one-episode character, despite leaving an enormous impact on Bikini Bottom and serving as one of the most visually impressive threats the show ever created during its early seasons. The episode begins with the French narrator describing another peaceful evening in Bikini Bottom and telling viewers to listen to the tropical tranquility. The camera shows the town of Bikini Bottom when something underground starts tunneling. This underground creature consumes the Bikini Bottom sign. The burrowing thing moves on to the rest of Bikini Bottom. A police officer is writing a ticket for a car parked near a fire hydrant. The creature, still invisible to the viewer, makes eating noises. The scene reveals that the car has completely disappeared. The cop responds by picking up the fire hydrant, moving it to the adjacent car, and placing the ticket on that car instead. He whistles as he casually walks away, apparently unbothered by the missing car. The creature moves on to SpongeBob's house. Gary wakes up, sees the thing, and meows in terror. SpongeBob is still sleeping and mumbling half asleep about getting 2 scoops and saying thank you. He tells someone to keep the change. The creature eats his blanket, but SpongeBob doesn't notice. The creature then eats his pillow. SpongeBob wakes up and says, "What?" He watches in horror as he sees the creature leaving his house with the whole side of the house eaten away. These opening scenes establish the threat before ever showing what the creature actually looks like, building tension through showing only the destruction it causes and the tunnel it creates, underground. The scene changes to show SpongeBob talking to a crowd gathered at the Krusty Krab. SpongeBob tells everyone he saw it, and that it was big, it was all wiggly, and it ate everything. Patrick responds by saying, "That's horrible." and then gobbles down an entire tray of food, containers and all. SpongeBob identifies the creature as an Alaskan bull worm. Each of the 3 words appears on screen as he says them. Alaskan is written in icy letters. Bull is written in furry letters, and worm is written in letters that resemble worms. The crowd mutters worriedly. A fish named Fred says the worm ate his wheelbarrow. He's holding his wheelbarrow, which has a bite taken out of it. A fish named Nancy Susie Fish says the worm ate her children's homework. Her 2 kids wink simultaneously and give a large thumbs up, clearly happy to have this excuse. Another unnamed fish has a huge bite taken out of his butt and asks if he needs to say what happened to him. The crowd murmurs more, and another fish asks how they can protect themselves. Mr. Krabs announces he's got it and suggests they should all buy a Krabby Patty. The crowd boos and throws ketchup and mustard bottles at him for his greed and for getting off topic. Nat Peterson suggests they should lock their doors. A fish named Mabel says they should call her nephew. Nightfish suggests they should dig a moat. Patrick announces they should take Bikini Bottom and push it somewhere else. The crowd immediately hushes down. Squidward says that idea may just be crazy enough to get them all killed. The crowd resumes worrying. Patrick asks what's wrong with his idea amongst the murmuring. Fred suggests they should get someone to go after the worm. Mr. Krabs says there ain't no one fool enough to take on an Alaskan bull worm. A horrible screeching noise is heard and the crowd flinches. The camera shows a scary-looking old guy in a raincoat with a hook for a hand. He's grinding the hook on the window of the Krusty Krab. He stops grinding. The transcript identifies him as an unnamed sailor. He asks if they have a bathroom in the place. Mr. Krabs looks slightly annoyed and says it's in the back. The sailor's legs wobble and he thanks Mr. Krabs before running toward the bathroom. This brief scene subverts expectations by making the scary-looking character completely harmless and just needing to use the restroom. Sandy appears wearing a wide-brimmed cowboy hat and announces she'll catch their worm for them. That is, if they're willing to pay. She tips the brim of her hat up. Mr. Krabs shouts no and says she'll never get a cent out of him. He runs to barricade the cash register with his body. He says he'd rather have that worm come in right now and eat everyone alive. He starts foaming at the mouth. The crowd looks at him strangely. Mr. Krabs calms down and apologizes. Sandy laughs good-naturedly and says, "Aw shucks, she doesn't want their money." She explains she was just playing up the drama of the moment. Mr. Krabs chuckles, which slowly turns into crying. Sandy continues by saying she's going to take that spineless critter down for nothing because this is personal. She tells them to look and shows them her tail is gone. The crowd gasps. Sandy says the varmint must have got her tail while she had her back turned, calling the worm a coward. The crowd empathizes with her. Sandy declares she's going to get back what's hers. The crowd cheers. SpongeBob looks alarmed and says Sandy doesn't know what she's up against because they're talking about an Alaskan bullworm. The 3 words appear on screen again. Sandy says she doesn't know nothing about Alaska, but to look at something. She brings out a wallet with pictures. She explains that back in Texas, she wrangled bulls and she wrangled worms. The camera shows pictures of a real-life squirrel with a lasso around a bull, then a lasso around a worm. Sandy says as far as she's concerned, doing them both together just saves rope. She announces she's going to go kick some wormtail and yells, "Yee-haw!" She sprints to the doors of the Krusty Krab and the crowd goes wild. SpongeBob tries to warn her that she doesn't know what she's facing. Sandy tells him not to worry and that she won't be long. She leaves. SpongeBob chases after her, calling her name. Mr. Krabs tells Sandy to go get them and that they have the utmost confidence in her. The crowd stops cheering. Mr. Krabs turns to Patrick and asks what that idea of his was. The scene cuts to all the citizens attempting to push the buildings of Bikini Bottom. Patrick yells, "Push!" and the citizens strain as they try to shove the town. This running gag continues throughout the episode as Patrick's absurd plan is actually put into action. The scene cuts back to SpongeBob chasing after Sandy and calling for her to wait. Sandy asks if SpongeBob is coming to watch. SpongeBob tells her not to go. Sandy asks why not. SpongeBob explains that he saw the worm and it's big, scary, and pink. Each word appears on the screen with big, displayed in large letters, scary in green drippy letters, and pink in pink fuzzy cursive letters. Sandy responds that Patrick's belly button is also big, scary, and pink, but she ain't afraid of that neither. SpongeBob says Sandy will get massacred and falls down into sponge cubes. Sandy tells SpongeBob she's from Texas, and what he thinks is big and what she thinks is big are two totally different bigs. She adds that the worm has her tail, and she can't take that sitting down. SpongeBob asks, what if the worm didn't take her tail? Sandy asks if the worm doesn't have her tail, then who does? SpongeBob unconvincingly says he does. Sandy asks where it is. SpongeBob says it's in his pocket. Sandy asks why he didn't just say so, and tells him to give it to her. SpongeBob looks anxious, pulls something from his pocket, and opens his hand. Sandy identifies what SpongeBob is holding as a paperclip and a piece of string. SpongeBob meekly says, "No, it's not," and claims this is her tail. Sandy says his name in an irritated voice. SpongeBob defensively asks how she would know because it's always behind her. He begs her not to go repeatedly and leaps onto the front of Sandy's air helmet to hug it. Sandy yanks him off and asks what's the matter with him. She announces she's going to give that legless rascal what for, and there ain't nothing SpongeBob can say to stop her. She jumps over SpongeBob and continues walking. SpongeBob asks, "Oh yeah?" and says what if he said blargin fazibble noggip. Sandy stops and admits that's slowing her down, but she's still going after the worm. SpongeBob appears next to an aggravated Sandy as she strides along. He tells her tails are so overrated and suggests they should forget about it and go home. Sandy keeps walking. SpongeBob reappears and says he's got ice cream with nuts. Sandy continues walking. SpongeBob appears once more, this time wearing a goofy squirrel mask on his face. He says, in a deeper voice, that he's Sandy's pappy speaking, and he forbids her to go after this worm. He tells her to come back. Sandy says he ain't her pa. SpongeBob stands in front of Sandy wearing boxing gloves and announces that if she wants to get to that worm, she's going to have to go through him. Sandy shoves through his body as if walking through a pair of swinging doors. SpongeBob grabs her ankles while crying and says he can't let her do this and won't let her get killed. He says if she finds the worm, she'll get eaten for sure. Sandy insists ain't no way some dumb old sea worm is going to make a meal of her because she's too Texas tough. SpongeBob keeps crying while clasping onto her ankles and says she's not tough enough. Sandy tells SpongeBob to quit his worrying and that she can take care of herself. She asks who's the strongest critter in Bikini Bottom. She grabs an anchor and pulls a boat down from the surface. SpongeBob admits she is. Sandy asks who put the hi-ya, hi-ho, K, in karate while making a K shape. SpongeBob is shaped like a U and says she did. Sandy asks who saves his yellow backside from certain destruction on a regular basis. SpongeBob's butt has property of sandy cheeks printed on it, and he meekly says she does. Sandy says right, and she can handle his little bullworm too, because she is the best there is. She declares there ain't nothing too big or too ornery for her to catch. SpongeBob says, okay. Sandy tells him to say it. SpongeBob starts to say there isn't anything, but Sandy corrects him saying, ain't nothing. SpongeBob repeats in a high-pitched voice like Sandy that ain't nothing. And then in his normal voice finishes that there's nothing too big or too ornery for her to catch. He tries to add but multiple times, and Sandy keeps cutting him off. He tries saying and, we, and I, but Sandy cuts him off each time. Finally, he says, yeah, but, and Sandy says no. SpongeBob says, you see, and Sandy says no again. Sandy cuts him off one last time with a frustrated groan when he tries to speak again. Sandy picks up some sand from the ground as if tracking an animal and sniffs it. She announces worm sign. She holds a small sign in her palm that has worm painted on it, which is a visual gag. She looks up and says the worm is in that cave. SpongeBob asks if Sandy is sure. Sandy says of course she is, and announces she's going in and ain't coming out until she's got a big heaping plate of worm stew. She walks into the cave. SpongeBob hides behind a rock and shudders. Viewers hear Sandy inside the cave saying, "Aha! There you are, you tail-nabbing varmint. Hi, yeah." The sounds of karate fighting are heard. Sandy peeks out of the cave and tells SpongeBob she's winning. She resumes fighting. SpongeBob tries to tell her that's not something, but Sandy peeks out again and says, "This shouldn't take long." She resumes fighting. SpongeBob tries again to tell Sandy that's not something. Sandy says she's almost done. SpongeBob calls her name. Sandy yells, "Yee-haw!" and comes out riding a pink segmented thing. She announces she got him. She makes a giant knot and stands on it proudly. SpongeBob is still uneasy and says her name. Sandy says, "Boy, howdy," and explains this critter put up some sort of fight. But she's from Texas, and as SpongeBob can see, no worm is a match for her. She says she even found her tail. The camera shows she has fastened her tail back together with some twine. SpongeBob tells her that's not the worm. Sandy looks annoyed with her arms crossed and says, "Pardon?" SpongeBob repeats that's not the worm and explains that's the worm's tongue. The camera zooms out to show that SpongeBob is right. The opening of the cave is actually the worm's open mouth. The worm's beady eyes blink with a squishy sound. This reveal shows the true massive scale of the Alaskan bullworm. What Sandy thought was the entire creature was actually just its tongue, meaning the worm is exponentially larger than anyone. In Bikini Bottom realized. Sandy's voice breaks as she processes this information. She says, "Oh, this is the tongue, and the whole thing is the worm." She freaks out and yells for them to run for their lives. SpongeBob and Sandy sprint away. The worm chomps down, roars angrily, and chases after them. SpongeBob asks what the plan is while they're running. They look back and see the worm approaching faster. Sandy yells to run faster. SpongeBob says he could have thought of that. He realizes something and says, "Hey, wait a minute. I was right, wasn't I?" Sandy says, "Later." SpongeBob says the worm is too big for her. Sandy tells him not now. SpongeBob says he wants to hear her say it. Sandy asks if they can talk about this another time. SpongeBob demands she say it. Sandy says his name. SpongeBob threatens to trip her if she doesn't say it. He continues running on one foot with the other poised to trip Sandy. Sandy says no and tells him to get away. SpongeBob keeps insisting she say it. Sandy finally agrees and admits SpongeBob was right and she was wrong. She says she was wrong repeatedly and asks if he's happy now. SpongeBob smirks and says he knew it. The worm emits another huge growl, prompting them to run even faster. They run up and down a sand mound, which the worm plows right through. They run past the fish from earlier, who is leaning over under his car's hood. His butt is bandaged up from when the worm bit it earlier in the episode. The worm passes by and inadvertently takes another bite out of him, wounding him once again. The fish yells, "Not again." This callback to the earlier joke shows the worm is still randomly eating things as it chases SpongeBob and Sandy. SpongeBob asks Sandy what they do now. Sandy is panting and sweating. The worm growls again. She sees the seemingly endless coral trees in front of them and says she's got it. She asks if SpongeBob still has that paperclip and string. SpongeBob says he's way ahead of her and reveals he fashioned a necklace out of them. He says it's an S for SpongeBob, or S for Sandy, explaining that way they can identify their bodies. Sandy says no silly and suggests S for save our skins. She takes the string and uses the hook of the paperclip to wrap the string around one of the coral trees. She grabs SpongeBob and swings them up and over the branch onto the worm's back. Sandy yells, "Yee-haw!" and says this is what she calls a rodeo. She says they'll be nice and safe up here. But this doesn't last long as the worm starts to plow into a ravine like a runaway train. A whistle blows. Sandy and SpongeBob scream upon realizing what's happening and begin running toward the end of the worm to reach the safety of the plateau. They jump off safely as the worm falls into the ravine. Sandy says they did it. SpongeBob celebrates and says the worm will never get out of there. Sandy says they saved the town. SpongeBob suggests they should go tell everybody. The scene shows all the citizens still trying to push Bikini Bottom to safety. The city is now at the bottom of the ravine, which is exactly where SpongeBob and Sandy just caused the worm to fall. Patrick yells, "Push!" and the citizens push the city. Patrick yells, "Push" again, and they push one last time. All the citizens cheer, "Hooray!" celebrating that they successfully moved Bikini Bottom. The worm lands directly on the city and crushes it. The worm says, "Ouch," in pain from the fall. This ending provides the ultimate ironic conclusion where Patrick's ridiculous plan to push the city somewhere else actually led to moving it directly into harm's way. The citizens' celebration is immediately cut short by the very disaster they were trying to avoid. The episode ends on this darkly comedic note. The Alaskan bull worm serves as one of the most impressive monster designs in SpongeBob SquarePants history. The creature's massive scale creates genuine tension rarely seen in the show, especially when the reveal happens that what Sandy caught was merely the tongue. The episode uses classic monster movie techniques like only showing parts of the creature at first, demonstrating its destruction before showing it fully, and building to the reveal of its true size. The worm's simple design of being pink and segmented with beady eyes makes it memorable, while also being somewhat grotesque. The fact that the worm only says one word in the entire episode, "Ouch," at the very end, emphasizes that it's not a character with personality, but rather a force of nature. The episode never explains where the Alaskan bullworm came from, how it got to Bikini Bottom, or what happened to it after being crushed by the city it had just destroyed. These unanswered questions add to the creature's mystique, while also keeping the focus on the comedy and action rather than exposition. The Alaskan bull worm represents how SpongeBob SquarePants could create memorable one-episode threats that became iconic parts of the show's legacy despite never returning. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have The Sea Bear, the camping episode. The Sea Bear, the camping episode. The sea bear represents one of the most absurd yet memorable creatures in SpongeBob SquarePants history, appearing as the main antagonist in the Season 3 episode The Camping Episode, which aired on April 3, 2004. Unlike most creatures or characters in the show that exist within the established underwater world logic, the sea bear serves as a parody of urban legends and old wives' tales about mythical creatures with arbitrary rules for avoiding them. The episode uses the sea bear to create comedy from the contrast between SpongeBob and Patrick's earnest belief in ridiculous superstitions versus Squidward's skepticism, only to reveal that the absurd creature actually exists. The sea bear demonstrates how SpongeBob SquarePants could take an impossible premise and commit to it completely, creating genuine tension and slapstick violence while maintaining the show's cartoonish tone. The character never appeared in another episode after this one, making it a true one-episode creation despite becoming one of the most quoted and referenced moments from the show's golden era among fans who remember the specific rules about how to avoid attracting a sea bear. The episode begins at nightfall at Squidward's house. Squidward is preparing for bedtime and enters his bedroom wearing a nightgown while carrying a book and cup of tea. He sighs and says, "Finally, the weekend is here." He gestures to a dance quarterly calendar on his wall and explains this isn't just any old weekend, but the weekend SpongeBob and Patrick go camping. Squidward wonders aloud if it wouldn't be great if they got lost in the woods and never came back. A thought bubble appears over Squidward showing his fantasy. In the thought bubble, SpongeBob is hiking with Patrick, and both have camping gear strapped to their backs. An owl hoots. SpongeBob and Patrick look worried. SpongeBob says he's scared. The thought bubble disappears. Squidward says that would be great and jumps into bed. He tells himself he's waited a long time for this, listing a soft bed, warm tea, a good book, and 2 whole days with no SpongeBob. He laughs just like SpongeBob and imitates his goofy big-eyed face. Squidward then hears SpongeBob's real laugh outside. Squidward asks, "What the?" and goes outside to find SpongeBob and Patrick in a tent complete with sleeping bags and reading books. The two are laughing. Squidward asks if they aren't supposed to be camping. SpongeBob says they are camping. Squidward points out it's not camping if they're 10 feet from SpongeBob's house. The camera zooms out to show the tent's location right next to SpongeBob's pineapple home. SpongeBob responds that it doesn't matter where you are as long as you're outdoors. He explains that while all those soft city folk are safe in their beds reading books, he and Patrick are out here pitting themselves against the formidable forces of nature. SpongeBob asks if Squidward wants to join them. Squidward says no. SpongeBob tells him okay, and to have fun inside. Squidward leaves. SpongeBob and Patrick pull their book back out along with a flashlight and begin to read and giggle. Squidward pops back into the tent glaring and asks what SpongeBob means by have fun inside. SpongeBob simply says, just have fun inside, and that he'll see Squidward tomorrow. Squidward says, oh, and bye. He exits. SpongeBob and Patrick resume reading. Squidward enters the tent again and gasps. He accuses SpongeBob of being a little sneak and says he sees what SpongeBob is doing. SpongeBob asks what. Squidward insists he can see what they're doing. SpongeBob asks what again. Squidward accuses them of saying he can't take it. SpongeBob tries to respond, but Squidward holds up his tentacle and interrupts. He accuses them of saying he's soft and that they think their little have fun inside challenge is going to make him come camping with them, but that's never going to happen. Squidward declares there's no way he's going to sit out there all night with two losers and tells them to get used to it. He exits the tent. SpongeBob tells him okay and to have fun inside. Squidward pokes his head back into the tent and blows SpongeBob and Patrick back with his loud voice. He announces that's it, and he's in, saying he'll show them camping. Squidward runs into his house. SpongeBob tells Patrick that Squidward's going to come camping with them. Both climb out of the tent and giggle. Squidward emerges with a large camping backpack. He starts to say they'll see how a real outdoorsman does it, but falls face forward on the ground, squished by the immense backpack. He finishes his sentence from under the pack. He climbs out from underneath and pulls a pouch from the backpack. He announces this is his remote-controlled self-assembling tent and tells them to watch and learn. SpongeBob takes out binoculars, and Patrick gets a notepad and a pair of half-moon glasses. Squidward tosses the pouch into the air and presses the remote, but the power fizzles and the tent appears unassembled in a pile on the ground. SpongeBob says that was great and asks how Squidward gets inside. Patrick says yeah, it's all crushy looking. Squidward says it isn't put up yet and calls them idiots. He grumbles while picking up the tent and fiddling with it. He accidentally rips it. SpongeBob acts like he's still taking notes and says, customization. Patrick says, genius. Squidward beats on the tent with a wooden stick. SpongeBob announces Squidward is tenderizing the ground. Patrick says, of course. SpongeBob tells Patrick to write that down. Patrick still appears to be taking notes, but there's just a tic-tac-toe game in progress on his notepad. Squidward gives the pile a huge kick, and it automatically becomes an assembled tent. He says, voila, the perfect tent collapses to pile form again. Squidward pushes it out of the way and says what could compare to just lying out under the stars. He takes a lone blanket and places it on the ground. SpongeBob and Patrick applaud and cheer wildly and vigorously. After various camping activities including eating marshmallows and singing the campfire song, the crucial moment arrives when Squidward decides to play his clarinet. Squidward says this is relaxing and holds up his clarinet. He begins playing Kumbaya awfully. SpongeBob and Patrick look alarmed. SpongeBob yells, oh no, and picks up a marshmallow, holding it into a slingshot. He says he'll save Squidward. SpongeBob slingshots the marshmallow at Squidward. It goes up his clarinet and sticks in the back of his throat. SpongeBob comes over to assist him. He asks if Squidward is all right and tells him to chew and swallow. SpongeBob asks if that's better. Squidward asks better and says he was just fine until SpongeBob launched that ballistic junk food into his windpipe. SpongeBob explains he had to because it's too dangerous to play the clarinet badly out here in the wilderness. SpongeBob says it might attract, and then whispers, "A sea bear." This is the first mention of the sea bear in the episode. Squidward responds in a low, cautious tone asking, "A sea bear?" He asks if SpongeBob means like the ones that, and then switches to an angry tone saying, "Don't exist?" SpongeBob asks what Squidward is saying. Squidward declares there's no such thing, and that sea bears are just a myth. SpongeBob says, "Oh no," and insists sea bears are all too real. He claims it says so in the Bikini Bottom Inquirer and holds up a cheesy tabloid newspaper. Squidward reads the cover story which says, "I married a sea bear." Patrick agrees and says, "Yeah," and Fake Science Monthly. He holds up another newspaper. Squidward reads, "Sea bears and fairy tales are real," and declares that's the stupidest thing he's ever heard. Patrick says, "Well, maybe it is stupid, but it's also dumb." This exchange establishes that SpongeBob and Patrick believe in the sea bear based on tabloid sources, while Squidward dismisses the creature as impossible. SpongeBob insists Patrick's right, and that sea bears are no laughing matter. He begins telling a story about once meeting a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy, continuing this chain through about 17 connections before mentioning the last guy's cousin. Squidward interrupts sarcastically and says SpongeBob is right. He should be more careful. He asks SpongeBob to tell him all the things he shouldn't do if he wants to keep the sea bears away. SpongeBob says, "Okay, and that's easy. First off, don't play the clarinet." Squidward asks then what? SpongeBob says never wave your flashlight back and forth really fast. Patrick adds that flashlights are their natural prey. Squidward says Patrick must be kidding. SpongeBob says don't stomp around because they take that as a challenge. Patrick agrees. Squidward starts writing on a notepad and tells them to go on. SpongeBob says, "Don't ever eat cheese." Squidward asks if that means sliced or cubed. SpongeBob whispers with Patrick and then says cubed, explaining sliced is fine. Squidward says, yeah, and asks what else. SpongeBob says never wear a sombrero. Patrick adds, in a goofy fashion. SpongeBob continues saying or clown shoes. Patrick adds or a hoop skirt. SpongeBob says, and never. Patrick says ever. SpongeBob says ever again. Patrick says duh. And then both say together, screech like a chimpanzee. Squidward says wow, and comments on how amazing it is that so many things can set a sea bear off. SpongeBob and Patrick huddle together shuddering and saying sea bears are horrible. Squidward says suddenly he has the sense they're all in danger. They ask why. Squidward says he doesn't know and runs off. He returns with a flashlight, clown shoes, hoop skirt, sombrero, and tray full of cubed cheese. A diabolical look is on his face. He says just a feeling. SpongeBob looks horrified and says no. Squidward says yes. SpongeBob says no again. Squidward begins making chimp noises. SpongeBob and Patrick beg Squidward not to do this. Squidward continues hooting, stomping, and waving the flashlight around while wearing all the items that supposedly attract sea bears. Patrick asks SpongeBob what they're going to do, because a sea bear is sure to come and eat them. SpongeBob tells Patrick not to worry and says he'll draw them an anti-sea bear circle in the dirt. He takes a stick and draws a circle around himself and Patrick. Squidward continues to screech like a chimpanzee. Patrick says good thinking and holds up another issue of Fake Science Monthly. He explains that all the experts say it's the only defense against a sea bear attack. Squidward ends his screeching and starts laughing. He calls them so gullible and points out he did everything that attracts a sea bear and nothing happened. Squidward asks if sea bears really exist. Why didn't one show up? SpongeBob suggests maybe it's because Squidward isn't wearing his sombrero in a goofy fashion. Squidward says oh and apologizes sarcastically for being so silly. He asks if SpongeBob means like this. Squidward tilts his sombrero to the right while laughing. Something off-screen takes the hat and turns it upside down instead. The camera zooms out to show an angry sea bear that inverted Squidward's sombrero. The sea bear looks like a giant fish with the head of a bear and claws on its fins. SpongeBob says, "No, like that." This is the actual reveal of the sea bear as a real creature, rather than just a myth. Squidward sees the growling sea bear and screams when it roars and chases him. The sea bear begins to maul Squidward off-screen, while SpongeBob and Patrick remain huddled inside their anti-sea bear circle. SpongeBob asks if Squidward is okay. Squidward appears looking bruised and battered and says no. SpongeBob tells him to quickly jump inside their anti-sea bear circle before the creature comes back. Patrick brings the anti-sea bear circle and drops it at his and SpongeBob's current position, saying sea bears often attack more than once. Squidward asks if they're crazy and insists a dirt circle won't stop that monster. He announces he's running for his life. SpongeBob and Patrick both yell no. The sea bear rushes back and attacks Squidward again. SpongeBob tells Squidward not to run because sea bears hate that. Squidward thanks him for the tip and says he guesses he'll just limp home then. SpongeBob and Patrick yell no again. The sea bear returns a third time, attacking Squidward. SpongeBob explains they hate limping more than running. Squidward starts to say, well, he guesses he'll just have to do something else. The sea bear attacks Squidward for the fourth time. SpongeBob says he should have warned Squidward about crawling. The sea bear attacks Squidward yet again. Squidward asks what he did that time. SpongeBob says he doesn't know and guesses the sea bear just doesn't like Squidward. Patrick suggests Squidward should pretend to be somebody else. SpongeBob tells Squidward to draw a circle and tosses him the stick. Squidward says okay. The sea bear attacks Squidward anyway. SpongeBob explains that was an oval and it has to be a circle. Squidward runs and climbs on top of SpongeBob and Patrick, who are still sitting in the circle. He tells them to move over. The sea bear comes up to Squidward in the circle, then notices the circle itself below. The sea bear snarls and points a threatening claw at Squidward before leaving. This demonstrates that the anti-sea bear circle actually works as protection. Squidward says, "Hey, it worked," and tells them they saved his life. All three celebrate and cheer. SpongeBob says, "Yeah," and he's glad it was just a sea bear, because the circle would never hold back a sea rhinoceros. Squidward asks what attracts them. Patrick explains it's the sound of a sea bear attack. A sea rhinoceros appears making snorting sounds. SpongeBob says good thing they're all wearing their anti-sea rhinoceros undergarments and asks, "Right, Squidward?" Squidward just says, "Huh?" The episode ends on this cliffhanger suggesting Squidward is about to be attacked by the sea rhinoceros. The sea rhinoceros is briefly visible as another creature that exists in this world. Though unlike the sea bear, which receives significant screen time and multiple attacks on Squidward, the sea rhinoceros only appears for a few seconds at the very end as a final joke. The sea bear serves as one of the most effective one-episode creatures in SpongeBob history because the episode commits completely to the absurdist premise. The extensive list of arbitrary rules about what attracts a sea bear parodies how urban legends and superstitions often have overly specific and nonsensical requirements. The detail that cubed cheese attracts sea bears, but sliced cheese is fine exemplifies this absurdity. The fact that wearing a sombrero in a goofy fashion specifically attracts them adds another layer of ridiculous specificity. The episode builds tension by having Squidward deliberately do everything on the list, while SpongeBob and Patrick watch in horror from their protective circle. When the sea bear actually appears, it validates SpongeBob and Patrick's beliefs while punishing Squidward's skepticism. The creature's design, combining a fish body with a bear's head and clawed fins, creates a memorable visual that feels appropriately bizarre for the underwater setting. The sea bear's repeated attacks on Squidward provide escalating physical comedy as SpongeBob keeps explaining new things that attract or anger the creature. Each time Squidward tries a different method of escape, he unknowingly does something else that provokes the sea bear. The reveal that sea bears hate limping more than running, and the warning about crawling, suggests there's an entire hierarchy of movements that anger the creature in different degrees. The anti-sea bear circle represents the most memorable element of the entire concept. The idea that a simple circle drawn in dirt provides absolute protection from a dangerous creature parodies various folk superstitions about protective symbols or barriers. When Squidward draws an oval instead of a circle and gets attacked anyway, it reinforces how absurdly specific the rules are. The fact that the circle actually works when Squidward finally gets inside it commits to the episode's internal logic completely. The sea bear noticing the circle, snarling at Squidward, and then leaving shows the creature respects this arbitrary boundary despite being powerful enough to maul Squidward repeatedly. This moment validates everything SpongeBob and Patrick claimed throughout the episode. The introduction of the sea rhinoceros at the very end extends the joke by suggesting there's an entire ecosystem of mythical creatures with their own specific rules for attraction and protection. The sea rhinoceros being attracted by the sound of a sea bear attack creates a logical chain of consequences, where one mythical creature inevitably leads to another. SpongeBob's mention of anti-sea rhinoceros undergarments suggests yet another layer of specific protective measures required for these creatures, though the episode ends before explaining what those undergarments are or showing whether they work. The sea bear demonstrates how SpongeBob SquarePants could take an impossible premise and execute it with perfect comic timing and commitment to the bit. The creature never appeared again after this episode, making it a true one-time character despite the memorable impact it left on fans. The specific rules about avoiding sea bears became frequently quoted and referenced in SpongeBob fan communities. The episode works because it validates the childlike belief in impossible things while also mocking overly complicated superstitions and urban legends. Squidward represents adult skepticism being proven wrong in the most painful way possible. SpongeBob and Patrick represent earnest believers who turn out to be correct despite their sources being obviously unreliable tabloids. The episode never explains where sea bears come from, why they exist, or how SpongeBob and Patrick learned about them. These unanswered questions add to the creature's mystique, while keeping the focus on the comedy rather than world building. The sea bear remains one of the most iconic one-episode threats in SpongeBob history, representing the show's ability to create memorable moments from absurd premises executed with complete commitment. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to The Tattletale Strangler. SpongeBob meets the Strangler. The Tattletale Strangler. SpongeBob meets the Strangler. The Tattletale Strangler represents one of the most memorable criminal characters in SpongeBob SquarePants history, appearing as the main antagonist in the Season 3 episode SpongeBob Meets the Strangler, which aired on October 11th, 2004. Unlike most villains in the show who have elaborate schemes or supernatural powers, the Tattletale Strangler operates as a straightforward criminal with a simple but terrifying reputation, built on his promise to strangle anyone who reports him to the police. The episode creates comedy from the contrast between the Strangler's genuine murderous intent and SpongeBob's complete obliviousness to the danger he's in, even when the Strangler is standing right next to him in an obvious disguise. The character demonstrates how SpongeBob SquarePants could take a dark premise about someone trying to murder the main character and turn it into absurdist comedy through SpongeBob's innocence and the escalating frustration of the would-be killer. The Tattletale Strangler never appeared in another episode after this one, making him a true one-episode character despite becoming one of the most quoted and referenced villains from the show's golden era among fans who remember his increasingly desperate attempts to finally strangle SpongeBob. The episode begins at the Krusty Krab, where SpongeBob is standing in front of the punch clock waiting for it to reach 8 o'clock. He gets impatient. The second hand stops a second before 8, shocking him. The second hand then touches 12, making it exactly 8 o'clock. SpongeBob happily punches in and jumps in the air. The scene pauses with him in midair. An automated voice announces his on-time percentage is 100%. The scene starts again. Squidward walks up to the time clock and says another day, another migraine. He laughs sheepishly at the audience and punches in. The scene pauses again. The automated voice announces Squidward's on-time percentage is 12%. The screen unpauses, and Squidward finishes saying migraine while laughing awkwardly. SpongeBob tells Squidward how great it is working at the Krusty Krab and keeps asking if Squidward agrees. Squidward says, "Yeah, great." They go back and forth saying, "Yeah," until Squidward gets annoyed and says yes loudly. SpongeBob tells Squidward to hold that thought because he's due in the parking lot for early morning litter patrol. He says, "May Neptune shine brightly on his harvest," and laughs. SpongeBob walks outside with a bag and a long, pointy tool. He sees litter and picks up trash. He tells a candy wrapper it looks like someone missed the trash basket and comments that kids these days are careless. Another piece of trash falls to the ground next to him. He gasps and picks up that trash too. SpongeBob says he's never seen such an epidemic and says at least it's all over now. More trash keeps falling to the ground around him, and he picks it all up quickly. He breathes exhausted as one more piece of litter falls down attached to a parachute. He gets infuriated and asks where all this litter is coming from. SpongeBob notices someone tossing trash out of a car. His eyes focus on a crumpled paper falling to the ground. He says not on his watch and walks up to the car. SpongeBob tells the person in the car that he will have them know it's against the law to litter. The person in the car responds by laughing and asking what SpongeBob is going to do. Call the police. The police arrive immediately. SpongeBob says yes. The police begin to handcuff the person in the car, who the episode identifies as the Strangler. The police walk past him in single file and continue cuffing him with more and more handcuffs. Squidward walks outside and asks how it's going. SpongeBob says, "Well, let's just say he hopes their litterbug there saved room for his just desserts." SpongeBob laughs and repeats, "Just desserts." Squidward says whatever and then notices who the police are arresting. He asks SpongeBob if he knows who that is. SpongeBob asks, "Who?" Squidward says that's the Tattletale Strangler. SpongeBob asks who again. Squidward repeats, "The Tattletale Strangler," and gives SpongeBob a wanted poster of the criminal. Squidward explains that the Tattletale Strangler has promised to strangle anyone who turns him in. The Strangler growls at them. SpongeBob and Squidward both look scared. SpongeBob says the Strangler seems kind of angry with them and asks Squidward about it. Squidward is already gone. SpongeBob calls for Squidward repeatedly. An officer identified as Officer Johnson tells the Strangler he's going to do time, hard time. SpongeBob walks up to the police officers. He greets them and asks if the Strangler is going to jail. An officer identified as Officer Nancy asks if SpongeBob means the Strangler. SpongeBob confirms, "Yeah, the Strangler." Officer Nancy says, "Oh yeah, he's going to jail for a long time." While sitting in the back of the police car, the Strangler draws on the back of the driver's seat headrest. He flips it to reveal an exact likeness of SpongeBob's face drawn on it. SpongeBob says, "Hey, that looks like him." The Strangler growls and mangles the headrest, symbolically killing the SpongeBob drawing. He chuckles evilly. SpongeBob screams in terror. Officer Nancy tells SpongeBob not to worry because the Strangler won't be able to strangle him. Officer Johnson agrees and says they have him chained up real good and he'll never get away. Officer Nancy says, "Oops, not again." The Strangler is gone from the police car with only his handcuffs remaining in his place. Officer Johnson says, "Yup, he got away." SpongeBob screams and falls over. He asks the nice officers if they'll protect him. Officer Nancy says they ain't bodyguards. Officer Johnson says yeah, and tells SpongeBob to give them a call if he sees the Strangler again, calling SpongeBob Tattletale. The officers drive off, leaving dust that makes SpongeBob cough. SpongeBob says those officers are right and that he needs a bodyguard. He runs into the Krusty Krab yelling for Mr. Krabs. SpongeBob tells Mr. Krabs there's a maniac after him and he needs a bodyguard. Mr. Krabs laughs and says he wasn't 5-time Golden Claws in the Navy for nothing. He says when the bully sees his moves, he'll be running scared. Mr. Krabs asks where this little bully is and what he looks like. SpongeBob says this would be him and takes out the wanted poster of the Tattletale Strangler. Mr. Krabs gasps in fear and identifies the Strangler by name. His appendages go into his body. He tells SpongeBob to go away and take his death cloud with him. The scene cuts to SpongeBob showing the wanted poster to various people around Bikini Bottom. He shows it to Larry, who turns into a real lobster on a plate. He shows it to a construction worker who pogos away on his jackhammer. He shows it to some guys at the Tough Tavern who all run off screaming, with some yelling, "Hold me, hold me." This montage demonstrates that everyone in Bikini Bottom is terrified of the Tattletale Strangler. SpongeBob is at the bus stop and says, "That's it. He's got to get out of town until he can find a bodyguard." The Strangler sits on a bench reading a newspaper. The Strangler overhears SpongeBob mention needing a bodyguard and says he might be able to help. SpongeBob walks over. He tells the Strangler he doesn't understand because he needs protection from the scariest guy in town. SpongeBob holds up the wanted poster. The Strangler reveals himself wearing a fake mustache. This is the Strangler's disguise, which remains throughout most of the episode. The Strangler laughs and says the guy in the poster doesn't look so tough. SpongeBob explains he tattled on the Strangler, and now the criminal wants to strangle him with his diabolical hands. SpongeBob adds that he hopes the Strangler's hands aren't dirty. The Strangler looks at his filthy hands and laughs. He reaches toward SpongeBob to strangle him, but a bus stops next to them. The Strangler quickly puts his hands behind his back and smiles as the bus drives off. The Strangler says there are too many witnesses around here. He walks up to SpongeBob and says he could be SpongeBob's bodyguard. The Strangler shows SpongeBob what he claims is his card, but is actually a drawn-over fake ID card. SpongeBob says it looks good to him and announces the Strangler is hired. SpongeBob says he feels safer already and asks what's next. A 5-cent price tag is visibly hanging from the Strangler's fake mustache, though SpongeBob doesn't notice this obvious clue. The Strangler explains that the maniac could be anywhere wearing a disguise. He points to an old man with a walker and suggests it could be him. He points to a baby in a stroller and says, "Or that baby." SpongeBob gets caught up in the game and points to a small rock on the ground, saying, "Or that pebble." He points to a stick. Then he points to a white piece of paper and says, "Or that receipt for the Phony Baloney Mustache Emporium." This detail reveals where the Strangler bought his disguise. The Strangler says that's his receipt and picks it up, putting it in his pocket. SpongeBob tells his bodyguard that his body is in the bodyguard's guarding hands. He asks what they do first. The Strangler suggests they go to a nice, quiet, secluded location, like behind an old dumpster or a dark alley where he can murder SpongeBob without witnesses. SpongeBob suggests they could go to his house and turn off all the lights. The Strangler says perfect, because that way no one can hear SpongeBob being strangled. He catches himself and corrects it to say protected. The Strangler laughs as the lighting grows dim around them. He says perfect again and laughs maniacally. SpongeBob agrees and says excellent while laughing with the Strangler. The lights turn back on. SpongeBob says, but first he's got to do a few errands. The Strangler says, "Okay, but tell SpongeBob to make it quick." SpongeBob sticks his tongue out and says Quick is his middle name. This begins a series of delays that prevent the Strangler from getting SpongeBob alone. The scene transitions with a bubble to show them inside the Barg and Mart grocery store. SpongeBob is looking at paper towels. He reads that one package says, "Best paper towel around," while another says, "Best paper towel in town." SpongeBob keeps repeating "in town" and "around" while trying to decide. He asks what his bodyguard thinks. The Strangler says whatever gets them to SpongeBob's house quicker. SpongeBob decides he'll take both packages. The scene transitions to show them at a dry cleaning business called Dry Cleaning While You Wait at the register. The dry cleaner hands SpongeBob his clothes. SpongeBob makes a thoughtful sound. The dry cleaner asks if there's something wrong. SpongeBob says he's not sure if these are his pants. The Strangler groans in frustration. The scene transitions to show them at a perfume store where SpongeBob sprays perfume on his wrist and holds it up for the Strangler to smell. SpongeBob asks how about this one and whether it's too overbearing. The Strangler asks loudly if they can just go to SpongeBob's house. The scene transitions to show them arriving at SpongeBob's home. SpongeBob announces they're here at SquarePants Manor. He tells his bodyguard that he wants to take this opportunity to say he's the best bodyguard a fellow could hope to have. The Strangler says all right, enough of the sappy talk. He tells SpongeBob to open the door so he can strangle him. The Strangler catches himself and says he means choke him. He catches himself again and says he means crush his windpipe. SpongeBob helps him out by suggesting, protect me. The Strangler thanks him. SpongeBob says don't mention it, and then accidentally calls him Strangler before gasping and correcting it to bodyguard. SpongeBob asks where he put his key and searches his pocket while the Strangler gets angry. The French narrator announces that 20 minutes have passed. SpongeBob is still searching for his key. The Strangler is even more angry with steam coming out of his head. SpongeBob says he can't find his keys and asks if the Strangler wants to take a look. The Strangler says to forget the key and suggests they climb through a window. He struggles reaching for the window and says he can't reach it. The Strangler asks if SpongeBob thinks he can hop up on the Strangler's shoulders. SpongeBob is wearing cleats. He says sure, and announces that with these spiky cleats, anything is possible. SpongeBob jumps onto the Strangler and yells. The Strangler asks, "Cleats?" SpongeBob's feet land directly in the Strangler's eyeballs. The Strangler screams in pain and tells SpongeBob to get his feet out of his eye sockets. SpongeBob starts tugging at his legs and says he's trying, but his cleats are stuck in the Strangler's corneas. The Strangler runs around in pain, screaming for SpongeBob to get off. The French narrator announces that 6 hours have passed. The Strangler is still running around until he finally pulls SpongeBob's feet out of his eyes. The scene shows the Strangler with bandages covering his eyes. SpongeBob tells his bodyguard not to be mad and says he'll just grab the key he keeps under the mat so they can get inside. The Strangler's eyes open widely underneath the bandages. He growls in rage, and a nuclear explosion effect comes out of his head, showing his extreme anger at learning the key was under the mat the entire time after all those delays. SpongeBob finds the key and calls it a little rascal. He explains that he'll put it in the lock, which should activate the tumblers, thus opening the door. The Strangler sneaks up behind SpongeBob, ready to strangle him while laughing evilly. SpongeBob opens the door and walks inside, telling the Strangler to step inside. The Strangler closes the door and says to close the door. SpongeBob says, well, here they are. The Strangler announces he finally got SpongeBob all alone and laughs evilly. SpongeBob says he knows and asks if it isn't great while laughing. The Strangler picks SpongeBob up. SpongeBob keeps laughing. The Strangler tells SpongeBob that now he's going to get his, calling him Tattletale. The lights suddenly turn on before the Strangler can strangle SpongeBob. SpongeBob stops laughing. All of SpongeBob's friends yell, "Surprise!" The camera zooms out to reveal that all of SpongeBob's friends are in his house cheering. They drop a sign that says, "Congratulations, SpongeBob, 100% on time." This references SpongeBob's perfect attendance record established at the beginning of the episode. The Strangler drops SpongeBob, sparing him from being strangled. SpongeBob asks if this is a surprise party to celebrate his perfect on-time percentage at work. The Strangler nervously places his hands behind his back. SpongeBob asks how they knew. Patrick says it's on the invitation SpongeBob sent them and holds up an invitation. Patrick tells everyone to boogie. SpongeBob goes to join the others and everyone parties. The Strangler sits down in SpongeBob's chair looking exhausted and defeated. The scene cuts to the end of the party. SpongeBob says goodbye to everyone and thanks them for coming. He lists off Mr. Krabs, Plankton, Sandy, Larry, Pearl, Mrs. Puff, Squidward, and the rest. Everyone leaves, and SpongeBob walks back into the house laughing. He says they're alone at last. The Strangler wakes up while gasping and asking what's happening. SpongeBob closes the door. The Strangler asks if they're all alone now. SpongeBob says just him, the Strangler, and the floorboards. The Strangler and SpongeBob begin laughing together again. There's a knock on the door and the laughing stops. SpongeBob opens the door to reveal everyone outside again. They all yell, "Happy birthday, SpongeBob." SpongeBob asks how they knew today is his birthday. Patrick says they just do what the invitations say. Patrick tells everyone to boogie some more. Everyone rushes inside the house and parties again. The Strangler walks back to SpongeBob's chair and sits down. The scene cuts to the end of this second party. SpongeBob thanks everyone for coming and says, "Whew." He closes the door and laughs, saying they're alone again. The Strangler asks if it's true and if everybody's gone. SpongeBob confirms. The Strangler asks if there are no more parties today, if SpongeBob has everything he needs now, if nobody's left, and if they're completely alone. SpongeBob says, "Oh yeah." The Strangler says in that case and starts laughing evilly. Patrick suddenly appears out of nowhere and says, "Great parties, huh?" The Strangler is startled. He tells Patrick sorry, but he's got to go, calling him Tubby. The Strangler carries Patrick toward the door. SpongeBob tells the Strangler to wait because they can trust Patrick since he's SpongeBob's best friend. The Strangler says he can't take any chances because for all they know, Patrick could be the Strangler. Patrick responds by saying he's the Strangler and that he should have known. Patrick says he's got to turn himself in. Patrick runs away and breaks through the wall of SpongeBob's house. SpongeBob processes this information and says so Patrick's the Strangler. The Strangler starts furiously steaming up. SpongeBob adds that you think you know a guy. The Strangler screams in total fury that Patrick is not the Strangler. SpongeBob asks if Patrick isn't the Strangler. The Strangler rips off his fake mustache while yelling that he is the Strangler. SpongeBob asks how the Strangler did that without shaving cream. The Strangler explains it's a fake and calls SpongeBob an idiot. He says he bought the mustache at the party store. Everyone suddenly comes back inside the house. Squidward cheerfully asks if someone said party. The Strangler screams and runs out through the wall, yelling that he can't take it anymore. SpongeBob runs after him, calling for his bodyguard and saying he needs protection. The Strangler gets into a taxi and tells the driver to step on it because he's being chased by a maniac. SpongeBob chases after the taxi, calling that he's not safe and for the Strangler to come back. The taxi goes to the Bikini Bottom airport and an airplane takes off. The Strangler is on the plane and says finally he's away from that guy. SpongeBob appears sitting in a row behind the Strangler on the airplane. SpongeBob says good idea and calls the Strangler bodyguard again. He says the Strangler will never find them up here. The Strangler screams and jumps out of the plane. He opens his parachute, but the parachute is actually SpongeBob himself. SpongeBob says good thinking and explains the Strangler could have been on that plane. The Strangler takes out a giant pair of scissors and cuts the strings off the SpongeBob parachute. The Strangler plummets down and crashes right into the Bikini Bottom police station jail cell. SpongeBob comes running up to him, calling for his bodyguard. The Strangler looks at SpongeBob and cries. He tells SpongeBob to look because he's not his bodyguard. The Strangler says he's the Strangler and points to his wanted poster on the wall. SpongeBob gasps in horror and identifies him as the Strangler. The police officers walk up. Officer Nancy congratulates SpongeBob on good work and says he put the Strangler behind bars. The Strangler says at least he's safe from that yellow idiot. Patrick appears in the cell and greets the Strangler, calling him Mac. The Strangler turns and sees Patrick is in the jail cell with him. Patrick asks what the Strangler is in for. The episode ends on this final joke. The Tattletale Strangler serves as one of the most memorable one-episode villains in SpongeBob SquarePants because the episode commits completely to the premise of someone genuinely trying to murder SpongeBob, while SpongeBob remains completely oblivious. The Strangler's fake mustache disguise is so obvious that it becomes part of the comedy, especially when SpongeBob points out the receipt from the phony baloney mustache emporium, but doesn't connect this to his bodyguard being suspicious. The escalating frustration of the Strangler creates the episode's main comedic tension, as every attempt to get SpongeBob alone is thwarted by increasingly absurd delays. The shopping errands, the 20-minute key search, the 6 hours of having cleats stuck in his eyeballs, and the 2 surprise parties all prevent the Strangler from accomplishing his goal. The episode uses dramatic irony effectively, since the audience knows the bodyguard is actually the Strangler, creating tension from watching SpongeBob unknowingly spend time with someone trying to kill him. The Strangler's character design as a large, intimidating fish with prominent features makes him visually distinct and threatening, though the fake mustache undermines this intimidation in a comedic way. The Tattletale Strangler represents how SpongeBob SquarePants could take dark concepts and transform them into family-friendly comedy through absurdist humor and the main character's innocent nature that inadvertently tortures his would-be attacker. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Clamu, the smoking peanut. Clamu, the smoking peanut. Clamu represents one of the most memorable animal characters in SpongeBob SquarePants history, appearing as the central figure in the Season 2 episode The Smoking Peanut, which aired on May 12, 2001. Unlike most animals in the show that exist as background elements or minor plot devices, Clamu drives the entire narrative despite having minimal direct interaction with the main characters. The giant oyster serves as both victim and catalyst for the episode's conflict, demonstrating how SpongeBob SquarePants could create comedy from guilt and misunderstanding, while building to an emotionally satisfying twist ending. Clamu's characterization as a gentle giant, whose emotional breakdown affects the entire world, creates genuine stakes for what initially seems like a minor prank. The episode explores themes of guilt, responsibility, and the consequences of thoughtless actions, through SpongeBob's anxiety about having upset this massive creature with something as small as a single peanut. Clamu never appeared in another episode after this one, making her a true one-episode character despite the significant emotional impact she has on SpongeBob and her memorable role in one of the show's most guilt-focused storylines. The episode begins at the Bikini Bottom Zoo during their annual Free Day. The French narrator explains that the zoo is having Free Day and lists various free items available. Free balloons are being given out, though Mr. Krabs disguised in a mustache steals all the balloons from a child. Free drinks are available, and Mr. Krabs fills up a huge barrel at a soda dispenser. The narrator mentions free light bulbs with a questioning tone. Mr. Krabs unscrews a light bulb from a path light and puts it into his pants just as police arrive and become suspicious of him. Mr. Krabs greets them nervously, and the cops walk away. He says his next stop is the gift shop and runs into it. This opening establishes Mr. Krabs as someone taking advantage of Free Day, which becomes important for the episode's resolution. SpongeBob and Patrick walk by wearing zoo hats. SpongeBob points out Oyster Stadium and explains they have the largest oyster held in captivity there. SpongeBob adds that the oyster also does tricks. He uses an announcer voice to explain that the oyster spits a giant pearl 100 feet in the air like a cannonball. SpongeBob demonstrates by crumpling up his hat and spitting it into the air. The hat lands in a little fish's ice cream. Patrick asks why they're hanging around watching a cheap imitation and suggests they get over to the actual stadium. The two run into the stadium together, yelling that this is the greatest day of their lives. Clamu is first seen inside Oyster Stadium. The transcript describes her as the enormous oyster. She is snoring and gurgling, clearly asleep when SpongeBob and Patrick arrive. Patrick looks at the sleeping oyster and says, "This is the greatest day of our lives?" Boring. SpongeBob agrees with Patrick and says they came to see pearls 100 feet in the air. He uses his announcer voice again for this. SpongeBob decides he'll try his oyster call. He makes a strange noise, trying to wake up Clamu, but gives up because the oyster is asleep. Patrick says he's out of there and thanks SpongeBob for nothing. Patrick walks away. SpongeBob tells the oyster to come on and wake up already. SpongeBob pulls out his bag of sea peanuts. He looks left and right to make sure no one is watching. He throws a peanut at the oyster. The oyster stirs. SpongeBob says he thinks it's working. The oyster frantically looks around. SpongeBob calls to Patrick saying the oyster is waking up. Patrick asks if he missed it. SpongeBob says no and that the show's about to begin. Instead of performing tricks as expected, The oyster suddenly cries at the top of her lungs. This is the moment when everything goes wrong. SpongeBob and Patrick get blown back toward the seats by the force of Clamu's crying. The oyster hops around while bawling. 2 zoo employees come running into the arena. One zoo worker asks, "What's wrong with Clamu?" This is the first time the oyster is identified by name in the episode. A zoo employee identified as Joe tries to calm her down. He says, "Easy girl, it's me, Joe, remember?" This establishes that Joe has a relationship with Clamu, and she should recognize him. However, Clamu snarls at Joe and uses her tongue to throw him out of Oyster Stadium. This demonstrates how upset Clamu is, as she's attacking even someone she knows who is trying to help her. Patrick and a nervous SpongeBob wait in the stands. Patrick says now this is a show, apparently enjoying the chaos. Outside the stadium, an announcer makes a public address. The announcer says, "Attention, zoo patrons. Clamu, the giant oyster, is on an emotional rampage. Please scream and run around in circles." Everyone begins to run around and scream following these instructions. The announcer thanks them for coming. Inside the stadium, Clamu is still smashing things and making snarling noises. The zoo worker approaches SpongeBob and Patrick. The worker tells them they better get out of this area right away. He explains there's nothing more dangerous than an emotionally disturbed oyster. The worker points at SpongeBob and asks if he did anything that might have caused this horrible tragedy. SpongeBob hesitates. Patrick answers for both of them, saying no way, explaining that only a jerk would upset a gentle giant. Patrick asks SpongeBob if he's right. SpongeBob hides the peanut bag and agrees while letting out a nervous shriek. Clamu chomps on a piece of metal in the background. The scene cuts to Patrick and SpongeBob leaving the zoo. Patrick says if he ever sees the guy who upset Clamu, he'd have a few choice words for him. Patrick lists those words as "you" and "are" and a jerk. SpongeBob and Patrick arrive at their houses. Patrick asks if SpongeBob is sure he didn't see anything suspicious. SpongeBob says he already told Patrick he didn't, and adds, "Sheesh." SpongeBob walks up into his pineapple. Patrick suggests they should investigate this crime and catch the lowlife who's responsible. SpongeBob tells Patrick to give it a rest, and that there's no crime to investigate. SpongeBob tells Patrick to go home and stomps into his pineapple, slamming the door behind him. Inside his house, SpongeBob mutters about stupid Patrick and insists he didn't do anything wrong. He sits down in his chair and tells himself he doesn't know what he's getting so worked up about. SpongeBob says he's sure that by tomorrow, this whole ugly mess will be a funny memory. He chuckles and turns on the TV. A news anchor named Johnny appears on screen. Johnny announces their top story is that a giant oyster has its feelings hurt. He explains the only clue that could be found was this lone peanut. Johnny says, as viewers can hear, the oyster continues to emit its horrible cry. The news shows that the cry is so powerful it can be heard around the world. The TV displays real people covering their ears in Egypt, Holland, and India. Johnny continues that the cry not only breaks the sound barrier, but breaks the hearts of their citizens. SpongeBob stares at the TV with a look of guilt and horror. Johnny asks what kind of cruel, careless, evil person would deliberately upset one of Neptune's most gentle creatures. Someone named Hans uses a tissue to wipe a tear off Johnny's face. SpongeBob turns off the TV. Gary meows questioningly. SpongeBob screams, "No, Gary!" and asks how he would know anything about the oyster. Gary meows again. SpongeBob asks if Gary thinks he's being defensive and insists he's not being defensive. He says barnacles and asks if this is 20 questions or something. SpongeBob peers out the window at Oyster Stadium, where viewers still hear Clamu's wailing. SpongeBob admits this is getting a little out of hand. He says all he did was throw a peanut, and he didn't mean to make the oyster cry. SpongeBob explains he just wanted to see the oyster perform spectacular stunts. He worries that everyone's going to hate him and decides he needs some advice. SpongeBob visits various characters seeking advice, but cannot bring himself to confess what he did. When he goes to see Squidward, Squidward complains about the noise. Squidward says that overgrown clam is giving him a headache and he can't even take his afternoon beauty nap. This shows that Clamou's crying is affecting everyone in Bikini Bottom, not just those at the zoo. When SpongeBob visits Sandy in her tree dome, Clamou is still shrieking audibly. Sandy says she can't stand it anymore and calls Clamou a poor critter. Sandy asks what kind of inconsiderate person would upset such a gentle creature. Sandy threatens that when she finds out who caused the oyster so much pain, there will be no more jiggery pokery. She demonstrates her anger by ripping the Bikini Bottom phone book in half in front of SpongeBob. This display of strength terrifies SpongeBob and prevents him from confessing to Sandy. These scenes establish that Clamou is universally regarded as a gentle creature who didn't deserve to be upset, which increases SpongeBob's guilt. Patrick continues his detective work and eventually finds footprints and a bag of peanuts. The police arrive at SpongeBob's house to investigate. One officer asks if SpongeBob is familiar with a peanut, holding up a peanut inside a bag marked Exhibit A. The police ask if SpongeBob was at the oyster's lair with Patrick Star. SpongeBob breaks down and confesses to everything, saying yes to all their questions. However, the police arrest Patrick instead of SpongeBob, apparently misunderstanding who was responsible. The police escort Patrick to the zoo, where a crowd has gathered. The crowd boos and jeers. A fish named Sandals suggests in a Cockney accent that everyone should throw peanuts at Patrick and see how he likes it. The crowd throws peanuts at Patrick. Patrick says he gets what he deserves while attempting to catch all the peanuts with his mouth. He says ouch when hit by the peanuts. SpongeBob follows and yells for everyone to wait and stop because he's the one they want. He declares he is the criminal. The crowd continues booing and jeering. Sandals suggests they throw peanuts at SpongeBob too. SpongeBob tells everyone to hold their peanuts and announces that Patrick Star is innocent. He says he has come to reveal the truth. SpongeBob makes a long speech about truth and honesty being rewarded with trust and forgiveness. He uses elaborate metaphors about laying his cards on the table and trimming branches of deception from the tree of life. Sandals interrupts, telling SpongeBob to just get on with it. SpongeBob finally confesses clearly. He announces he is the one who threw the peanut. He says he knows now that what he did is wrong. SpongeBob apologizes to the giant performing oyster, to Patrick, and to the citizens of Bikini Bottom. Sandals suggests the crowd should throw peanuts at both SpongeBob and Patrick. The crowd starts yelling in agreement. Before this can happen, the zoo worker objects and tells everyone to wait. The zoo worker pulls Mr. Krabs out for the crowd to see and announces here's the real criminal. Mr. Krabs greets everyone nervously, and his fake mustache falls off. SpongeBob identifies Mr. Krabs in shock. Everyone gasps. Patrick claims he knew it all along. The zoo worker explains that Mr. Krabs has stolen a very important item from the oyster. The worker accidentally rips off Mr. Krabs' clothes while trying to reveal the stolen item. The crowd reacts in disgust. The zoo worker says to wait a minute and puts Mr. Krabs' clothes back on. He then reveals what Mr. Krabs actually stole, telling everyone to behold Clamou's pearl. The crowd gasps in shock. This is the major revelation that recontextualizes everything that happened in the episode. Clamou was not upset because SpongeBob threw a peanut at her. She was upset because her pearl had been stolen. The zoo worker gives the pearl back to Clamou, saying, "Here you go, girl." Clamou sniffs her pearl and the crowd cheers. This is the first time the audience has seen Clamou calm and happy during the episode. Suddenly, something unexpected happens. The pearl starts to crack like an egg. Everyone watches in amazement as it hatches. Out comes a baby oyster. The baby oyster says, "Mama, Mama," looking for its mother. SpongeBob exclaims, "Mother of pearl, the oyster's a mother, and that pearl's no pearl, it's an egg." This explains why Clamou was so distressed. The object Mr. Krabs stole was not just a valuable pearl, but actually Clamou's egg containing her, baby. The baby oyster continues calling for its mama. Clamou responds with an affectionate, "Aw." The baby oyster and Clamou embrace each other. Everyone watching says, "Aw," at this touching reunion. The crowd then glares at Mr. Krabs. Mr. Krabs nervously points out that it's free day, apparently trying to justify his theft. The crowd boos as they throw peanuts at Mr. Krabs, burying him under the peanuts. This ending provides justice as the actual criminal receives the punishment, while SpongeBob and Patrick are cleared. Clamu serves as an excellent example of how SpongeBob SquarePants created emotional depth through characters who barely interact directly with the main cast. The oyster never speaks, except for making crying sounds and one "aw" at the reunion with her baby. She never has a conversation with any character or demonstrates human-level intelligence beyond basic maternal instincts and emotional responses. Despite this limited characterization, Clamu becomes the emotional center of the entire episode. Her crying affects the whole world and drives SpongeBob's guilt throughout the story. The episode uses Clamu to explore how our actions can have consequences we never intended and how guilt can consume us even when we're not actually responsible for the harm we think we caused. SpongeBob genuinely believes his peanut throw caused Clamu's breakdown and suffers tremendous guilt over what he sees as a cruel prank. The revelation that Mr. Krabs stole Clamu's egg provides a satisfying twist that absolves SpongeBob while explaining Clamu's extreme reaction. A mother separated from her child naturally would be distressed, regardless of any thrown peanuts. The episode cleverly misdirects the audience into believing SpongeBob's peanut throw was responsible for Clamu's emotional state when the real cause was much more serious. The characterization of Clamu as a gentle giant creates sympathy for her situation. Multiple characters describe her this way throughout the episode. Patrick calls her a gentle giant. The news describes her as one of Neptune's most gentle creatures. Sandy calls her a gentle creature. Even the zoo worker describes nothing being more dangerous than an emotionally disturbed oyster, implying that normally oysters are not dangerous. This establishes that Clamu's aggressive behavior, throwing Joe out of the stadium and smashing things, is completely out of character for her. She is normally docile and performs tricks for zoo visitors. The fact that such a gentle creature has been driven to this level of distress makes the situation more tragic and increases SpongeBob's guilt for believing he caused it. The episode also emphasizes Clamu's size to create a contrast between her massive physical power and her gentle nature. She is described as enormous, the largest oyster held in captivity, and capable of spitting pearls 100 feet in the air like a cannonball. When she cries, the sound is powerful enough to blow SpongeBob and Patrick back toward the seats and can be heard around the entire world. This immense power makes her gentleness more remarkable and her maternal devotion more touching when reunited with her baby. Clamu's role demonstrates how the show could create effective storylines around characters who exist primarily as plot devices, rather than fully developed personalities. The oyster's emotional state drives the entire plot, but the episode focuses on SpongeBob's reaction to that emotional state, rather than Clamu herself. Viewers never learn Clamu's thoughts or motivations beyond the basic maternal instinct to protect her offspring. The episode never explains how Mr. Krabs managed to steal the egg when he stole it, or why Clamu didn't immediately identify him as the thief. These details are unnecessary because Clamu exists to create a situation that tests SpongeBob's conscience and forces him to confront his guilt over a seemingly minor action. The twist ending reframes the entire episode by revealing SpongeBob's guilt was misplaced. His peanut throw was a minor annoyance at worst to an oyster already distressed about her stolen egg. This absolves SpongeBob of serious wrongdoing while still validating his guilt over being inconsiderate. The episode teaches that we should think about how our actions affect others, while also showing that we sometimes take on guilt for things beyond our control. Clamu represents how SpongeBob SquarePants could create memorable characters and emotional moments through minimal characterization, combined with effective storytelling and a well-executed twist ending. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.